Let's talk about what you need to know to take this course. As I mentioned before, this course is the third part of my ultimate HTML and CSS series. Ideally, you should have watched the first two parts, but if not, at a minimum, you need to be familiar with semantic HTML elements, basic CSS properties like colors, borders, shadows, fonts, and so on, selectors and pseudo-selectors, CSS box model, absolute and relative positioning, flex and grid layout, media queries, responsive images, transformations, and transitions. If you don't have a good understanding of these concepts, you're probably going to find this course a little bit challenging, and I encourage you to go back to the first or the second part. Now, assuming that you know all these concepts well, let's move on to the next lesson. So, assuming that you're the right student for this course, let's talk about how I've structured this course and how you can get the most out of it. So, in the next lesson, I'm going to talk about the tools we're going to use to build this website. Then, in the following lesson called Setting Up the Project, I'm going to give you a zip file that contains the Photoshop design mockups, as well as all the supplementary materials like images, icons, and fonts. Then, in every lesson, we're going to code a specific part of this design. Every lesson is packed with tips and tricks, so I really don't want you to miss any lessons. I've worked really hard on these lessons to make sure I could teach you everything that I've learned over the past 20 years of web development. Now, we all have our own way of learning things, but as the creator of this course, I believe the best way to take this course is to get actively involved in building this website. So at the beginning of every lesson, I'm going to talk about the problem we're going to solve. So you can either code along with me, or you can try to solve the problem on your own and then come back see my solution, whatever works for you. But get actively involved. If you just watch this course passively, you're not going to remember all the details. There are a million things I'm going to talk about. And by the way, to make it easier for you to follow through, I've included the before and after code in each lesson. So if you screw up, just download the zip file attached to the lesson and start over. And one more thing, if you get stuck, you can ask your questions on our forum. Unfortunately, I'm not able to personally answer your questions because of the volume of messages and emails I get. I just can't do that. I'm really sorry. But I encourage you to participate in discussions because that helps you better learn and remember. With all that, let's move on to the next lesson. All right, to get started, first we're going to create a new folder and call it Moshify, or you can call it whatever you want. Then we're going to drag and drop this folder onto VS Code. Good. Now we add a new file here called index.html. Here we type an exclamation mark and then press tab to get a basic HTML template. Good. Next, we open up the Explorer panel. The shortcut is Command and B on Mac or Control and B on Windows. So it's this panel right here. Now in this folder, we're going to add a new folder called CSS. In this folder, we're going to add two style sheets. The first style sheet is normalized CSS, which we talked about in the first part of this series. So go to Google and search for normalized CSS. It's this website right here. What normalized CSS does is that it makes sure that all browsers render HTML elements consistently. So right-click here and download the latest version. We could also use NPM, but that is outside the scope of this course. Now we drag normalized CSS and drop it into the CSS folder. Good. Then we create another file in this folder called styles.css. This is where we're going to write all of our styles. So in this project, we're going to write all of our styles in a single style sheet. But in a more complex project, we want to split our style sheet into multiple files and then combine them together using CSS preprocessors like Sass or Less. Now, to make sure that everything works, I'm just going to write a basic style here and set the background of the body element to gold. Good. Now, back to index.html. Let's add a couple of link elements. The first one is to reference CSS/normalize CSS. And the second one is to add styles.css. Good. Now, to serve this page, we need live server. That's another extension we need. I forgot to mention it in the previous lesson. So go to the extensions panel and search for live server. It's right here. So install this. Then when you are on an HTML file, if you right click, you can find this command, open with live server. Good. So our project is set up properly. Now we need to add it under source control. So back to VS Code, let's go to the source control panel we're going to initialize a Git repository here. A Git repository is like a database that tracks our project history. So every time we write a bit of code, we take a snapshot of our project, and using Git, we store it in this repository or in this database. Then later on, we can come back and view our project history. We can see what piece of code we wrote for implementing what features. So let's go ahead and initialize a repository. Good. Now, in the source control panel, we can see the list of files we have changed. So we have index.html as well as these two CSS files. So Git has detected that these are new files. Now we're going to commit these files into our Git repository. So on the top, we type a message that explains what this commit or what this snapshot is all about. For the first commit, we're going to say initial commit. Then later, as we work on a task, we type some meaningful message for that task. We'll see that later in this course. So now let's click on this icon and make our first commit. Beautiful. So everything is ready. Now, if you look below this video, you're going to find a zip file. When you uncompress it, you're going to find these folders. So we have the code folder where you can find the completed code. Then we have the fonts folder. You need to install these fonts on your machine so you can open the design files in Photoshop. So in this folder, we have two subfolders, two different types of fonts. For each of these fonts, we have a bunch of TTF files. So we can double click on one of these files like Montserrat Regular. Then we can install this font. Now, in this window, and by the way, this is Mac, on Windows, you're going to have a different interface. Regardless, you should be able to install multiple fonts in one go. So we can click on this icon and then go to the fonts folder and select all these fonts all together and install them. Good. Back to this folder, we also have icons. All these icons are in the SVG format, which we talked about in the second part of this series. We also have a bunch of supporting images in JPEG and PNG format, and the source files, the source design files in PSD. To open these files, you need the latest version of Adobe Photoshop. If you don't have Photoshop, you can download a trial version for 7 days. It's absolutely free. And after that, if you want to continue using it, you can pay a low monthly fee. I've been a Photoshop user for years, so it's totally worth it. So go ahead and download Photoshop. Next, I'm going to show you the essential Photoshop skills you need as a web developer. All right, let's talk about the tools I'm going to use throughout this course. In terms of my browser, I'm going to use Google Chrome and Chrome DevTools. But in some lessons, I will switch to Firefox, which you can get from mozilla.org. Firefox has this fantastic DevTools, which is more pretty than Google Chrome, but it also has some additional features, which we're going to talk about later in the course. Now, in terms of my editor, I'm going to use Visual Studio Code or VS Code, which you can get from code.visualstudio.com, the same editor we used in the first two parts. You're welcome to use your favorite editor, but in this course, I'm going to show you some really cool extensions for VS Code that makes it a lot easier to write HTML and CSS code. So here in VS Code, let's open up the extensions panel. The first extension we're going to use is HTML CSS support. It's right here. What this extension does is it scans our project for CSS files, and then it gives us auto-completion when typing CSS class names. Here's an example. Let's go to this file, just a basic playground file. So we have this div, and we want to give it a class. If we type H, we can see all CSS classes that start with H. So this is really handy. Now, the second extension we're going to use is CSS Peek. It's right here. With this extension, we can quickly navigate between our HTML and CSS code. So back to the previous example, with CSS Peek installed, if we hold down the Command key on Mac or Control key on Windows, then we can click on this class and go to its definition in our CSS file. As you can see over here, we have two definitions of this class. Here's the first one. Here's the second one, where we redefine this class for screens that are wider than 800 pixels. So CSS Peek makes it really easy to navigate back and forth between our HTML and CSS files. Now, the next extension we're going to use is Prettier, right here. We use this extension for formatting our code. Now, once you install this, then I want you to go to Code, Preferences, Settings, and search for Format on Save. Make sure this option is enabled. So every time we save our file, Prettier kicks in and automatically reformats our code. The next extension we're going to install is highlight matching tag right here. With this extension installed, when we highlight the closing tag of an element, it highlights the opening tag. This is particularly helpful when we have a complex markup with a lot of elements, with a lot of divs, for example. We don't know where an element opens and where it closes. So back to this file, if I click on the closing tag of the head element, you can see the opening tag is highlighted and there's a yellow underline right here. So pretty helpful. The last extension we're going to install is to-do highlight. With this extension installed, we can type to-do or fix me comments in our style sheet, and this will highlight them for us. So let's go to a style sheet here. If I type a comment and start it with to-do, look, it just got highlighted. We can also say fix me. I think that's pretty cool. Now, the last tool we're going to use in this course is Git. We use Git for tracking our project history and deploying it on the internet in the future. If you're not familiar with Git, don't worry at all. We're not going to use many of the Git features. We're just going to stick to the very basics. And by the way, I have a comprehensive 6-hour course on Git in case you're interested to learn more. So to get Git, go to git-scm.com. Download the latest version. It's pretty easy. It takes only a few seconds. With all that, we're ready to start our project. All right, let's talk about the essential Photoshop skills you need to convert a design mockup to HTML and CSS. So I've opened standard.psd in the latest version of Photoshop. Now we can press Z to select the zoom tool. And by clicking, we can zoom in. Or if we press Alt and then click, we can zoom out. Pretty easy. Now, if you hold down space and drag and drop, we can move around. Good. Now, these blue lines you see here, they're called guides. We can hide them by going to View and deselecting extras. We also have a shortcut here. On Mac, it's Command and H. On Windows, it's Control and H. All right, now let's see how we can pick the color of various elements. So I'm going to zoom in and find out the color of this button. So on the left, look, we have this tool called eyedropper tool. If you don't see this, click and hold, then you will see this panel. So in this section, we have a bunch of tools. The first one is eyedropper tool. We have other tools like ruler, which we're going to use in a second. So we select eyedropper. We also have a shortcut for this. The shortcut is I. So with this selected, we can click on the button. And over here, we can see this color selected in the foreground. So by clicking on this box, then we can see the color picker box. And down here, we can see the color in hexadecimal. We also have the color in RGB if you want to use it. So this is how we can pick colors. Now let's see how we can find the size of fonts. So I'm going to press the space and move around. Let's find out the size of this title. So we press T to enable the type tool. Then we click on the text. You can see the text is selected. Obviously, we can change it. Now over here, you can see the size in points. But in web design, we don't want to use points. Points are used in printing. So we go to Photoshop, Preferences, and Units and Rulers. If you're on Windows, the Preferences menu is probably under the Edit menu. I think it's down below. So let's go to Preferences and Units and Rulers. Now over here, we can select the unit for types. I'm going to change this from points to pixels. Good. Now we can see the size of this heading in pixels. And by the way, this size is for desktop. So here's the mobile version of our design. Let's zoom in and find out the size of the heading. It's 70 pixels. So as we're building these components, pay close attention to these sizes. They vary between mobile and desktop. Now there is something tricky about finding the size of a font. Using the type tool, if we don't click in the right spot, let's say if we click over here, we end up inserting new text. If that happens, simply press the escape button and the text that you just inserted disappears. So zoom in, always zoom in and then select the text to see its size. So this line is 20 pixels on mobile, okay? Now to get out of this, we simply press the escape button. Good. Now let's see how we can measure the size of elements or their distances. So back over here, to our eyedropper tool, we click and hold and select the ruler tool. If you want to use keyboard, hold down Shift, and by pressing I, you can iterate over these tools, okay? So I'm going to select the ruler tool. Now, we can see the size of this button by clicking here, dragging, and going to the other side, okay? Now up here, you can see the width in pixels, that is 398 pixels. We're not going to use these exact values. We'll use values that will be really close to what you see here. Using the same technique, we can also measure paddings and margins. So let's click here and drag. So over here, you can see the padding. The height of our ruler is now 24 pixels. So when coding this, we will use a relative unit that will eventually map to somewhere around 24 pixels. It doesn't have to be the exact value, but the value that we'll choose will be very close to what you see here. So that's pretty much it. You learn how to pick colors, how to find out the size of fonts, and how to measure the size of elements and their distances from each other. Now, the last thing I want to cover is the history panel. If you accidentally screw something and insert something in this design, you can easily undo it. So we go to the window menu, then we open up the history panel. Over here, you can see all the changes applied to this document. So currently I haven't inserted anything, but if I use the type tool and accidentally type something here, it doesn't matter. Then we can see a new change in the history. So we can go one step back, or we can simply delete this from here. As simple as that. In the second part of this series, we talked about modular or component-based CSS. The idea of modular CSS is to break down a page into a bunch of reusable components and then compose those components together to build a complex layout. So here's the page we're going to build. I want you to pause this video for a few seconds and write down the components that you see on this page. So think about it. When you're ready, come back, continue watching. Okay, here's my answer. On the top, we have a navigation bar. So we're going to build this navigation bar in isolation, as if this is the only component that exists in the world. Down below, we have what we call a banner or a hero component. So a hero component contains elements like a heading, some text, a button, and an image. Now this button itself is another component that we're going to build in isolation. And as you will see in a second, we will have variations of this button. Now, further down in this section, we have an input field with a button inside it. This is a particular kind of component, so we're going to build this in isolation as well. Then we have what we call a badge. And as you can see, we have multiple instances of the badge component. So this is our main badge component, but we also have variations that can have a different background color. Now look at this list. There are many places on this page or perhaps on other pages where we want to show a list of items horizontally. So we can call this component an inline list. An inline list doesn't have bullet points and all the items are inline. Another example of an inline list is the menus in our navigation bar, okay? So let's keep going. Then we have the card component. In this component, we have elements like this title here, the price, billing cycle. Then we have a badge component. So a component can contain other components or elements. These elements like the price or billing cycle are internal in this component. They don't make sense outside of this component, okay? Now in this card component, we also have a list with the style. So we have a list with green ticks. And as you can see, this list is repeated in multiple places. Then we have another kind of button here. That's the light version of our buttons. Let's keep going. Over here, we have this icon in this particular shape. Now, this might not be immediately visible as a component, but if you look at the icons folder in the zip file that I gave you earlier, you will see that all our SVG files contain a black icon. But this icon that we have here is slightly different. It has a blue color and is placed on a round background. Now, further down, you can see other instances of this icon component. We can call this icon round, okay? Now, look at this link. We have many links with this particular style. So this is another component we're going to build in isolation. Now, there is another component here that is not immediately visible, and that is a grid component. So look at this layout. We have two columns on the left. We have an image, then we have some other elements here. There are many places on this page where we need a 2-column grid. Here's one example. There's another example up here. Again, we can put these elements inside a 2-column grid. In the first column, we have these elements. In the second column, we have this image. Now, when we make the page smaller and view it on mobile, our 2-column grid turns into a 1-column grid. So we can build this grid component in isolation and reuse it in multiple places. Now, over here, we have a 3-column grid. So we have 2 kinds of grids on this page. Okay, let's keep going. Then we get to the control panel section. Now, once again, we have a 2-column grid. In the first column, we have this image. Then we have these items. Now, each of these items is what we call a media object or a media component. So a media component contains an image or an icon on the left side. And on the right side, it contains a heading and some text. This is the same pattern that you see on a lot of websites. Think of Facebook, Twitter, any kind of social networking application. They always have this pattern. This is officially called a media object or a media component. So we can build this component in isolation and then repeat it in multiple places. So to build this entire control panel section, we're going to build these media components and then put them inside a 2-column grid. Okay? Now, what component do we have here? Well, we can assume that all our quotes should have this particular style. So the text should be slightly larger. It should be italic and in this color. Down below, we have this line and the name of the author, followed by the name of the company. So we can encapsulate all these elements inside a quote component. Then we can combine that quote with an image, put it inside a card. This is the same card component that you saw further up. So we can combine this together and call this combination a testimonial. With this, all our testimonials will have the same look and feel. Now, further down, we have what we can call a callout component. A callout component is to encourage people to take action. So here we have this beautiful background color and another variation of our button component. Now, finally, in the footer, we have a bunch of lists. These lists don't have bullet points. So we can create a list component that doesn't have any bullet points. Then we'll have a variation of this list, which we call inline list, for displaying items horizontally. So to build this page, first we're going to build all these individual building blocks or components. When all these components are ready and they look great on mobile, tablet, and desktop screens, then we'll compose them together to build this page. Once we have this library of components, we can combine them to build other pages as well. Before building any components, let's start off by defining our color palette. A color palette often includes a primary color, a secondary color, and an accent color. Of course, we can have additional colors, but first we need to identify these primary, secondary, and accent colors. So look at this design. This design is mostly centered around blue. We have different shades of blue. We have this blue, which is kind of medium blue. We have a lighter blue and a darker blue. So I'm going to pick this blue as our primary color, this other blue as our secondary color, and the orange as our accent color. Now back to our style sheet, we're going to define our color palette using variables so we can reuse them in multiple places. But first, I'm going to delete this rule. We don't need it anymore. Now we're going to use the root pseudo-class selector, which matches the HTML element to define our global variables or custom properties. So we add double hyphens, then we give our variable a name like color-primary, and we set it to 2584FF. Similarly, we have color secondary, which we set to 00D9FF, and color-accent, which we set to FF3400. Good. Now for our text, we have two different colors. We have this really dark purple, which is used in headings. It's also used here. And we have a lighter purple, which is used for the body text. But there is an exception here. Let's take a look at this section. This paragraph has a different color than the main body text. This could be an accidental mistake by the designer, so I don't want to add too many colors in our style sheet. I want to consolidate these colors. So for this paragraph, I'm going to use the same color that we use for our body text. So back to our style sheet, let's define two more colors, one for our headings, which is 1B0760, and another color for body text, which we set to 918CA4. It's a really light gray that has a shade of blue or purple, okay? Good. So we have defined our color palettes. Now we need to make a commit to our repository. So here in the source control panel, we can see the list of files that are changed. If we click on a file, we can see the before and after picture. So we removed this rule and added this rule. This is the benefit of using Git. So as we work on our project, as we work on each task, we can review our code, make sure it's nice and clean. Then we'll take a snapshot and store it in our repository. So over here, let's make a commit and say, define the color palette. So this message will be associated to this snapshot. Later, when we look at our project history, we can see how each snapshot or how each commit changes our source code. So let's go ahead and make a commit. Good. Next, we're going to define our typography. All right, now let's talk about typography, which is all about fonts and their sizes. So first, we're going to look at the mobile version of our design because we're going to take the mobile first approach. Then we'll readjust our styles for wider screens. So here in Photoshop, we're going to activate the type tool by pressing T. Then we click on this heading to find its font. It's right here, Enter. Now this is the same font used everywhere else on this page, except in one case. Here in the testimonial section, we have a different font for the name of the person. So look, it's this font, Montserrat, or however you want to say it. This is the only place where we have used this font. So here I want to consolidate the fonts and drop this font because, as I told you before, every time we import a new font, we're increasing the cost of downloading our page. So I want to minimize the number of fonts that have to be downloaded. Now, to get these fonts, we're going to go to fonts.google.com, and here we search for Inter. It's right here. All right. What styles do we need? Well, back to our design mockup. For this element, which is an H2 element, we're using Inter Extra Bold. For the body text, we're using Inter Regular. For this other heading, we're using Inter Bold. And further down in the dark section, for this heading, we're using Inter Semi-Bold. So we have quite a few variations of this font. Now, sometimes these are done accidentally by a designer, but other times they're deliberate. Now, in this case, I want to do some consolidation because I don't think all these variations really make a big difference to the end user. So I want to limit the number of styles for our font because every new style that we add will result in a separate font file to be downloaded. So back to Google Web Fonts. Here's the regular style. I'm going to select this. Now let's close this panel. Then further down, we have the bold style. Let's select this as well. Good. Now on the top, we can view our selected styles. So Inter in regular and bold. Great. Now we need to copy these two link elements and add them to our HTML markup. So back to our HTML markup, I'm going to paste these before the other link elements. Good. So next, we go to our style sheet and define a rule for our body element. So body, I'm going to set the font family here. So all elements will automatically inherit it. Font family is Inter. Now I want to include some fallback fonts in the same style. This is a sans serif font, so I'm going to include Arial, Helvetica, and sans serif. Good. Now to make sure that everything is working up to this point, we go to index.html and add a few elements. Now let me show you a cool trick. I want to render an H1, an H2, and an H3. So we type H, then we add a $sign. This will be replaced by numbers like 1, 2, 3, and so on. Now inside the heading tags, we want to have label like heading 1, heading 2, and heading 3. So here in braces, we type heading, space, and a $sign. Again, the $sign will be replaced by 1, 2, 3. At the end, we multiply this by 3 and then press tab. We quickly created this structure. Now let's add a paragraph with some dummy text. Let's say 20 words. Good. We're using the right font, but the colors are not right. So back to our style sheet. For our body element, I'm going to set the color to color body. This is the right color. Great. Now for our headings, we're going to use a different color. So over here, we're going to define a rule for our headings. H1, H2, and H3. Here we set the color to color headings. Good. So that's exactly what we wanted. Now we need to set the font sizes. So back to the mobile version of our design. Here's our H1 element. The size of this element is 70 pixels. So back to our style sheet. Here we want to define a rule for our H1 element and set the font size to, but we don't want to use 70 pixels here because, as I told you before, pixels are absolute units. They're not flexible. So if the user changes the default font size in their browser, our web page is not going to reflect that change. So here we want to use the rem unit. Now, if we set this to 1 rem, that means 1 times the font size of the HTML element. Now, currently we haven't set the font size for the HTML element. So by default, it's going to be 16 pixels. This is set by the browser. Now, earlier I showed you a trick. So if we set the font size of the HTML element to 62.5%, that means 62.5% of 16 pixels, which is what? 10 pixels. So let's set this to 62.5%. Now, when we set the font size of the H1 element to 1 rem, that means 10 pixels. So this makes calculations easier. Now back to our design mockup, the font size of the H1 element is 70 pixels. That is equivalent to 7 rems. Similarly, the font size of our H2 elements is 40 pixels. So that is equivalent to 4 rems. So back to our style sheet. Here I'm going to set the font size to 7 rems. For H2, I'm going to set the font size to 4 rems. And for H3, I'm going to set the font size to 3 rems. Now, what about H4, H5, and H6? Well, we don't have them on this page. So for now, I don't want to worry about them. We can always come back and add them if you really need them. Now we should also set the font size for our body text. So up here in the body element, we set the font size to, on mobile, our body text is 24 pixels. So that is equivalent to 2.4 rems. So 2.4 rems. Good. Here's what we get. Looks great. Now these lines are a little bit too close. So back to our rule, I'm going to set the line height to 1.5. And as you know, this means 1.5 times the current font size. All right, now we have some space here and it's easier to read this paragraph. Great. Now the last thing we want to adjust is the margin below each of these headings. So currently there is so much space between this heading and this paragraph. So back to our design mockup, we need to measure the distance between this heading and the paragraph. So let's select the ruler, draw a line. This is an approximate value. So over here, look at the height. That is 20 pixels. So equivalent to what? 2 rems. So for H3 element, I'm going to set margin bottom to 2 rems. Here's what we get. We still have so much space between the heading and the paragraph. So let's inspect the heading using Chrome DevTools. All right. Now here in the Styles tab, down below, look at the margin below the heading. It's 20 pixels or 2 rems. Now I'm going to select the paragraph element and I want you to look at the top margin. It's 24 pixels. So here we have margin collapsing. So the margin below the heading and the margin above the paragraph are collapsed into 24 pixels. So even though we set this property here, it's not really making a difference because the margin above the paragraph is greater than this value. So to solve this problem, we can define a rule for our paragraphs and set the top margin to 0. This way, we let the headings decide the margin above the paragraph, okay? So here's what we get. It's better than before, but still we have so much space here. Compare this with our design mockup. So what is happening? So back to this page, I'm going to select this H3 element. Now look at the space below the character G. We have some space here. Do you see that? So the font that we're using here already includes some space above and below each character. So to make our page as close as possible to our design, we have to use a smaller value for bottom margin. Let's say 1 rem. Here's what we get. I think this is very close to our design mockup. Great. Now, before recording this lesson, I did some experimentation and realized we should use the same bottom margin for H1 and H2 elements. Now, we don't want to duplicate this property here and in our H1 element, it doesn't make sense. So I'm going to take this from here and apply it in this row. This way, we have a single place for setting the bottom margin. So we're done with the mobile version. Now let's look at the standard version for laptops and desktop computers. So real quick, look at the size of this heading. That's 80 pixels. So now I want you to pause the video and find the size of H2, H3, and body text. Now back to our style sheet, we're going to write a media query for screens that are larger than 1024 pixels. This is kind of a standard breakpoint that a lot of frameworks like Bootstrap and Tailwind use. So media screen and min width 1024 pixels. For our body element, we're going to set the font size to 1.8 rems. For H1, we're going to set the font size to 8 rems. For H2, we're going to set the font size to 4 rems. And for H3, we're going to set the font size to 2.4 rems. So here's what we get for mobile. Now let's resize the browser and see what we get for laptops and desktops. Do you see the difference? Beautiful. So we're done here. Now the last step. We go to the source control panel. We review our changes and then make a commit. We want to take a snapshot of our project at this point in time. So here for the message, we say, define the styles for the fonts. So this message properly identifies what this commit or what this snapshot is all about. Now, let's go ahead and make the commit. Beautiful. So we're done with topography. Next, we're going to implement our first component. All right, the first component we're going to implement is this link component. So here in our markup, first we're going to delete all these elements and add an anchor. I'm going to give it a class, let's say link-arrow. And for the label, we can say learn more. Now back to our style sheet. First, I'm going to define a new section called links. So this way we can logically separate various rules. And also I realized that in the last lesson, I forgot to add a section for our topography. So over here, we're going to add a section called topography. Good. Now back to our new section. I'm going to define a class called link-arrow. What styles do we need here? Well, first we're going to set the color to color-accent. Then we're going to set text transform to uppercase because every letter in this link is uppercase. Now, our links don't have an underline, and that applies across the board. So if you look at the navigation bar or the footer, none of these links have an underline. So I want to define a new rule here for all anchors and set text decoration to none. This way we don't have to repeat this property for the links in the navigation bar and the footer as well. Okay. Now for the font size, we're going to set this to 2 rems and we're going to set font weight to bold. And of course, I picked all these values from the mobile version of our design. All right, here's what we get. What is currently missing is the arrow after the link. To implement that, we're going to use the after pseudo element selector. So we type link arrow ; after. Now here we're going to set the content to 2 hyphens followed by a greater than sign. If this doesn't work, we can always come back here and add an icon. Now save the changes. All right, here's what we get. I want to add some margin before the arrow. So margin left, we set it to 5 pixels. Now, why am I using a pixel value here? Because I want this space to always be the same no matter how large the font is. I just want to have a tiny bit of space before the arrow. So take a look. I think that looks better. Now, what about the hover effect? When we hover on this, I want the arrow to move to the right. We're going to define another rule, link arrow. Then we're going to go to the hover state and target the after element. So with this rule, we are essentially targeting the element that we dynamically insert here, but in the hover state, okay? Now in this state, I want to increase the left margin. So from 5 pixels, we go to 10 pixels. Now take a look. So that looks pretty good, but the change happened so suddenly. I want to apply a transition and make this smooth. So back to this rule where we insert the arrow, we set the transition property to. Now what property are we animating here? The margin property. So we can say margin should change in 0.15 seconds. Now take a look. That's much nicer. Now if you pay close attention here, this arrow that we have is slightly different from the arrow we just created. But don't worry about that. Again, we can always come back and add an icon. Now let's look at the desktop version. On desktop, our links are a little bit smaller. They're 15 pixels. So once again, we have to write a media query for wider screens. Now we have two options. One option is to go back to this media query that we wrote earlier. Perhaps we can move this at the end of our style sheet and then write a new rule for link-arrow and say font size is 1.5 rem. So that's one option. The problem with this approach is that this rule will be far apart from the main rule that we defined for mobile. So every time we want to change something, we have to jump up and down for adjusting the styles for mobile and desktop. So I personally prefer to define the media query close to each component. So we're done with topography here. Now in our links section, I'm going to define another media query here for the links component. So screen and min width 1024 pixels. Again, we're targeting wider screens. So here we define a rule and say link-arrow. Its font should be 1.5 rems. Now you might argue and say, but Mosh, we have repeated this media query. Isn't this bad? Isn't this duplication? Well, this is not really a big issue because how many components are we going to have? Let's say 15 to 20. So we're going to have 15 to 20 extra lines, and those extra lines are not going to increase the size of our style sheet. Also, we don't want to have a single place for defining these breakpoints because as I told you in the second part of this series, these breakpoints are arbitrary. The value we use really depends on our design. It depends on our components. Maybe for a particular component, we want to change the breakpoint. So we don't want to have a single place to apply styles for all components, okay? So let's quickly test it. Here's the mobile version. Now I'm going to make the browser wider. Good. That's the desktop version. So because mobile screens are small, we use larger fonts for our body text or links so they are more readable. So we're done with this implementation. Now, one thing I like to do is to create a folder called components and then have a sample of each component in that folder. Later, as we build more complex components, we're going to forget the markup we need. So here in the Explorer panel, let's add a new folder called components. Inside this folder, we're going to add a new file called links.html. And now I'm going to grab this link element from index.html and copy it here. This is just a template. So this is not supposed to be a full-blown HTML page. Just a small template so we know what kind of markup we need for this particular component. All right, we're done here. So once again, we're going to go to the source control panel and make a commit. Going forward, I'm not going to show this in videos because it's going to be repetitive. So for one last time, let's type a message here and say, build the link or arrow link component and make a commit. Beautiful. All right, the next component we're going to implement is the badge component. As you can see here, we have variations of badge components. So we have large badges and small badges. And also in terms of color, we have these badges that are in light blue and this other badge that is in medium blue. So this is where we're going to apply object-oriented CSS principles. We talked about this in the second part of the series. So the second principle of object-oriented CSS says that we should separate structure from skin. So we're going to define two different classes here. One class to give this the basic structure in terms of the padding and font size. Then we're going to define a few other classes to give this element different skins, like different colors and different sizes. So in our style sheet, let's add a new section and say badges. Good. So first we're going to define the structure. We're going to call this class badge. I'm going to set the border radius to 20 pixels. Again, here I'm using an absolute value because I don't want this radius to be dependent on the font size. Now for padding, I'm going to use 0.5 rem for vertical padding and 2 rems for horizontal padding. And of course, you can use any values you want. as I was experimenting with these values, I thought these values are closest to what we see in our design mockup. Next, we're going to set the font weight to bold because all our badges have a bold font. And finally, I'm going to set white space to no wrap. This prevents a badge from wrapping into a second line. This is particularly important when we have limited space. For example, let's say we have a small card and we have limited space for our badge. We don't want this badge to wrap into a new line. Whatever we put inside this badge should always appear in a single line. So using this property, we can disable wrapping. So this is the structure. Now let's define a skin. So this is where we're going to use the BEM naming convention, block element modifier. So using 2 hyphens, we separate a block or a component from a modifier, like primary. So here we're going to use our primary color. So we set the background to var color primary and the text color to white. We're going to define another skin for the secondary color. So we set the background to color secondary and the text color to white. Now to test this, let's go back to index.html and add a span with 2 classes, badge and badge -- primary. And for the label, we can say 10% off. That's not working. Well, looks like I made a mistake and here I should have used 2 hyphens. Good. Now, one thing that is really off for me here is the weight of the font. So I set the font weight to bold because here we have the bold version of Inter font. But when we see this in the browser, this bold font looks a little bit too thick. Now back to index.html, this is where we're loading this font from Google. So currently we're loading this font in 2 different styles with a weight of 400 and 700. What if we add 600 here as well? Well, first I thought we're going to get an extra font file, but then I did some experimentation. Let's fire up DevTools, go to the Network tab, and refresh the page. Look, we have a single font file. So even though we are requesting 3 different styles of this font, we have a single font file. How is this happening? Well, here on Google Fonts, I read the documentation of the Inter font. Look over here. Inter is a variable font family. These variable fonts are newer and allow us to store multiple styles of a font inside a single font file. But because they are somehow new, we don't have a variable version of every font out there. So for the most part, when we request different styles of a font from Google or other font services, we'll end up downloading multiple font files. But if a font is a variable font file, we'll get a single file no matter how many styles we request. So that means we can request other styles without increasing the size of this page. So back to our badge, I'm going to change the font weight from bold, which is 700, to 600. That looks better, it's more readable, but the font is a little bit too large. Here in the mobile version of our design, look at the font size of this badge. It's 20 pixels, but our body text is 24 pixels. So for normal badges, I want to use 2 rems for the font size, and then I'm going to create a separate skin for small badges, and there I'm going to use 16 pixels or 1.6 rems for the font size. So back to the badge class, let's add font size 2 rems. And as I told you before, we should do our best to keep these properties sorted. This makes our code more readable. So we bring up the command palette and sort lines in ascending order. Much better. So this is for our normal badges, and here's what we get that's closer to our design mockup. Great. Now let's create a separate skin for small badges. So another class, badge -- small. And here I'm going to set the font size to 1.6 rems. Now to test this, we go back to our markup and apply a second class here, badge -- small. Take a look. That looks great. Now the beauty of this approach, the beauty of object-oriented CSS is that we can combine these classes in any way we want to produce different results. Maybe somewhere I want a secondary small badge. Maybe somewhere else I want a primary small badge. Here's what we get. Maybe in another place, we want a primary badge that is not small. we simply remove this class. And here's what we get. So we're done with the mobile version. Now we need to adjust the font size for larger screens. So right here, we're going to write another media query and say for screens that are wider than 1024 pixels. For our badge class, we're going to set the font size to 1.5 rams. And for small badges, we're going to set the font size to 1.2 rams. 1.2 rams. Good. So let's test it real quick. Here's the mobile version and here's the desktop version. Great. So we're done with this component. Now, just like before, I want to save a copy of this markup in the components folder. So copy. Now in the components folder, we create a new file called badges.html and we paste it here. We could also paste other examples like primary, secondary, and primary with a small badge. That also works. So we're done with this task, and now it's time for what? For committing our code into our repository. I'll let you do that, and I will see you in the next lesson. All right, now let's talk about lists. Here we have a few different types of lists. We have horizontal or inline lists and vertical lists with green ticks. One thing that is common across all these lists is that they don't have the default bullet points. The same applies to all the links in the nav bar and the footer. So back to our style sheet, let's define a new section called lists. Here I'm going to define a list class and set list style to none to get rid of the default bullet point. Also, I want to get rid of the left padding that all browsers apply by default. So padding left, 0. Now, another thing that is common between different types of lists is the color of the text. So our lists are not inheriting the main body text color. They have a different color. This is the color that we are using for our headings. The same applies in this horizontal or inline list. So let's set the color to var color headings. All right, now to test this, back to our markup, let's add a UL with the class of list. And inside this UL, we're going to add 3 list items. Now I want to give each list item a label. So we type li, then in curly braces, we type our label, let's say item, and then we add a $, which will be replaced by numbers like 1, 2, 3, and so on. So at the end, we multiply this by 3, press tab, and here's what we get. Great. So back to the browser. Here's a basic list template. Now let's create a variation of this list called inline list. So once again, we want to apply object-oriented CSS principles and separate structure from skin. So back to our style sheet, we define a new class, list, double hyphens, inline. Now in inline lists, we want to convert each list item to an inline element, but we don't want to add the list item element here because now our CSS knows about our HTML structure. So we're going to go back to our markup and give each list item a class. So we're going to add multiple cursors here and then type class equals list double underscores item. So once again, we're using the BEM convention. In BEM, we separate a block from its elements using double underscores. So this item is an element inside this block. It's not another block or another component that can exist on its own. It's an internal part of this list, okay? Now, back to our styles. So we're going to target items with a class of list double underscore item. Here we set their display to inline, but with this, we're not going to be able to apply margins. So a better approach is to set this to inline block. Now, back to our markup, let's convert this to an inline list. So list, double hyphens, inline. And by the way, did you see the auto completion? This is coming from one of the extensions we installed earlier. So list, inline. Good. All right, here's what we get, but the items are too close. So we need to give each item a right margin. So back to our style sheet, we give each item a right margin of 2 rems. Take a look. That's better. So we're done with inline or horizontal lists, but if you pay close attention here, these items are bold, but the items in our list are not bold. So shall we go back to the list class and set the font size to bold? No, we shouldn't. What if we want to have a list of items that are not bold? We don't want to apply this across the board. Otherwise, in different places, we'll have to come back and undo this style. So we shouldn't apply this property here. Our list should simply represent a plain list of objects. It can be vertical or horizontal, which we can also call inline. Anything extra should be applied in other places, perhaps using other skins, or maybe in this particular section, we want to display items as bold. Then, when building this entire component, we will make the list items bold. So we're done with the horizontal and vertical lists. Now, let's work on lists with this particular style. So we're going to define a new class or a new skin called list _tick. And of course, we can call it anything. Now, for these lists, we need this icon, tick.svg. You can find it in the icons folder of the zip file that I gave you earlier in the course. So here in the project folder, let's add a new folder called images. And then we're going to drop this file over here. Of course, we could drop all the icons and images, but I prefer to add only what we really need. Okay. So we have this icon. It's an SVG file. Back to this class, we're going to set list style image to, using the URL function, we're going to load our SVG file. So currently we're in the CSS folder. We have to go one level up, then go to images and load tick.svg. Now back to our markup. Let's change the skin from inline to tick. And then preview our changes. Where are the ticks? Well, they're kind of off the screen. To bring them, we need to apply a left padding to our list. So here we set padding left to 3 rems. Here they are. Now currently, these items are so close to green ticks. Here on mobile, look, we should have some space between the ticks and the items. So here we're going to define another rule. For lists with this particular skin, our items should have a left padding. So list item, we apply a padding left of half a rem. So this is a good case for using nesting. We cannot avoid nesting here because if we remove the tick skin, this style will be applied to all list items. This is not what we want. So this is where we want to use nesting, but as much as possible, we should avoid nesting because we'll end up with overly specific selectors. So here's what we get. Good. Now, if you look at the mobile version, you will see that we have some vertical space below each item. So we can fix that real quick by applying a bottom margin of 1 rem. Take a look. I think this is very close to what we have on mobile. Great. So we're done here. Now let's work on the desktop version. On desktop, the only difference that I noticed is that the space between ticks and the items is a little bit smaller. Take a look. See? The space is a bit smaller. So let's define another media query. 24 pixels. Here we're going to say, for lists with a tick skin, our items should have a padding left of 0. So on mobile, we apply half a rem padding. On desktop, we apply 0 padding. Now let's test the changes. So here's the mobile version and here's the desktop version. Great. All right, we're done with this component. Now let's take a copy of this and store it as a template inside the components folder. So we add a new file called lists.html and paste this markup. Okay, so we're done. And just like always, now it's time to review our code and commit it to the repository. All right, now let's talk about icons. So here in this folder, we have a bunch of SVG icons. Now, if you're on Mac, you can preview these icons by pressing the space button. So look, all these icons are black and they're placed on a white or more accurately, a transparent background. However, if you look at our design mockup, you can see these icons are blue and in some cases, they're placed on a circle with a background color. Now, the great thing about SVG files is that we can restyle them using CSS. So we don't have to supply different versions of these images. Now, before I show you how to do that, first we want to combine all these SVG files inside a sprite. We talked about image sprites in the second part of this series. An image sprite is a single image that combines multiple images. With this, we can reduce the number of HTTP requests sent to the server. So this is an optimization technique. So head over to Google and search for SVG Sprite Generator. There's so many online tools out there. There are also command line tools you can use as part of your build process. In this lesson, I'm going to use this tool, SVG Sprite.es. So take a look. Now, back to this folder. I want you to select all these files except two files, attributions.txt and logo.svg. There's a problem with this logo file. Unfortunately, the designer that I worked with to prepare these files, he didn't know much about vector graphics, so he couldn't fix the problem. Now we're going to drag and drop all these files here. Great. Now we have a SVG sprite. We can download it right here. Good. Next, we're going to add our sprite to the images folder. Good. So look, an SVG file is essentially a text file. It's not a binary file like JPEGs, GIFs, and so on. What you see here is called XML. It's short for Extensible Markup Language. It's another markup language similar to HTML, but HTML has limited elements, but XML is extensible. So we can use XML to define our own elements. SVG files have these particular elements like SVG, symbol, path, and so on. So here we have multiple symbols. Each symbol represents an icon. Now in each icon, we can have one or more paths. So these paths are essentially curves that define an icon. As simple as that. Now, we're going to go to index.html. Let's get rid of this markup. Now, back to this website. Down below, you can see examples of showing an SVG icon using this sprite. So I'm going to copy one of these elements. And don't worry if you cannot see this. I'm going to show you in a second. So we paste that here. We have this SVG element with the class of icon. We're going to define this class in a second. Now, inside this element, we have the use element with the href attribute. This attribute references an image or a symbol in a sprite. Now, here we have #WordPress. This is the ID of this symbol in our sprite. So let's go back to our sprite real quick. Look, each symbol has an ID attribute. This is exactly the same ID attribute we have in HTML. So here we have an icon called quotes, and this is based on the name of the file. Here's another icon with the ID of menu and so on. So back to this HTML, with the use element, we can use an SVG defined somewhere else. Now in this particular case, we're referencing an element with the ID of WordPress, but that element does not exist on this page. So we have to load it by referencing our sprite file. So we go to images, then sprite.svg. Make sure to spell it properly, otherwise it's not going to work. So save the changes. All right, here's what we get. So we could successfully load an icon from our sprite. Now let's work on sizing. So we go back to our style sheet and define a new section called icons. Here we're going to define the icon class. And we're going to give our icons a width of 40 pixels and a height of 40 pixels. Now take a look. Great. So that was the first step. Next, we're going to work on colors. So once again, we're going to apply object-oriented principles, and we're going to define separate skins for these icons. So we define a new class called icon primary, and here we're going to use our primary color. So we're going to use the fill property, which only applies to SVG images, and then we can type color primary. So see, I didn't have to type var, I just typed color, and using auto-completion, we got the var function, okay? Now, back to our markup. Let's add this new class, icon primary, and now our icon is blue. Great. So we can create additional classes like icon secondary, icon accent. I'm not going to create them because we don't have any use case for them at this moment. So I don't want to solve a problem that doesn't exist. This is one of the problems I see amongst a lot of developers. They try to over-engineer and solve unexisting problems. What we are doing here is building components for this design. We're not building a reusable library or a framework that other people are going to use. So I'm not going to create all variations of these icons for different sizes, different colors. That's a waste of time. We'll just end up writing extra code that has to be maintained, okay? So we have solved the problem with color. Now let's work on this circle. So to implement this, I'm going to wrap this icon with another element So we bring up the command palette and search for wrap. We're going to wrap this with a span with the class of icon-container. So here's what we get. We have a span with this class, and inside this class, we have an icon. Now, back to our style sheet. Let's define this new class, icon-container. Now, why am I using a single hyphen here? Well, this is not a variation or a modifier for the icon class. This is an entirely new class. And in BEM, we use a single hyphen to separate multiple words, okay? So I'm going to give our container a background of gold. This is temporary, so we can see things clearly. I'm going to give it a width of 64 pixels. And by the way, if you're wondering why I'm using pixel values here, it's because if you look at our mobile and desktop designs, our icons are always the same size. They don't change relative to the screen or the font size. So that's why I'm using an absolute unit here. Then I'm going to give the height of 64 pixels. Now to make it round, we're going to apply a border radius of 100%. Let's see what we get up to this point. We have this weird shape, which is kind of like an oval. The reason this is happening is because spans are inline elements. And as you know, width and height properties have no effect on inline elements. So here we're going to set the display to inline-block. Now, why shouldn't we use block? Well, maybe we're going to put this icon next to an element and we don't want a line break there. So that's why we use inline block. Good. So now we have a round shape, but our icon is not in the center. How can we solve this problem? Using flex. So we're going to change the display from inline block to inline flex. Now, to put the icon in the center, we're going to set two properties. Justify content for aligning along the primary axis, which is by default the horizontal axis. And then we're going to set align items to center. And this is for aligning along the secondary axis, which is by default the vertical axis. So now take a look. Beautiful. Our icon is right in the middle. The only problem is the background color. So I'm going to change this to F3, F9, FA. This is the same background color used in our design. So let's test the changes. Here's what we get. That looks great. Now, back to our markup. I'm going to remove the primary class and see what happens. So we have a black icon on this background. Once again, this is the benefit of object-oriented CSS. So we're separating structure from skin, and we have different skins, and we can combine these different skins to achieve different results. All right, we're done here. Now, let's store this markup in a separate file for reference. So back to the components folder, let's add a new file called icons.html. And then grab all this code and move it here. Great. So we're done. Now it's time for what? For reviewing our code, making sure everything's clean, and then committing into the repository. Next, we're going to build our button components. All right, now we're going to implement buttons. Our buttons have quite a few variations in terms of size and color. So we have these orange buttons where we're using our accent color. We have this other kind of button without a background color. So we only have an outline here. We can call these buttons outline buttons. Now look at the size of this button. This button has stretched to fill the container. So in terms of the size, we have two types of buttons. Some buttons only stretch to fit their content, like the search button up here. So this button has stretched to fit the content. In contrast, we have this other kind of button that has stretched to take up all the available space. We can call these buttons block buttons. Just like we have block elements with the width of 100%, we can also have block buttons with the width of 100%. Now down below, you can see the hover effect of an outline button. Also, in the call to action section, we have another button with the secondary color. So we're going to implement these buttons, but how about you pause the video and build these buttons on your own? Because you have all the necessary skills, all the necessary knowledge to implement these buttons on your own. So pause the video, do your best to implement these buttons, then come back see my implementation for some additional tips and tricks. So I'm going to add a button element with two classes, btn and btn primary. This is the skin that gives it the primary color. Let's say by now. Now for the styles, we're going to define a new section called buttons. First, we're going to define the structure. So I'm going to set the font size to 1.8 rem. that is for mobile. For desktop, our buttons are going to have a smaller font. We'll talk about that later. Then we're going to set the font weight to 600. Now, our buttons always have uppercase letters. So we set text transformation to uppercase. Now, for padding, I'm going to use 2 rems of vertical padding and 3 rems of horizontal padding. Let's see our changes up to this point. So here's what we get. Next, we need to get rid of this ugly border and make the border round. So we set border to 0 and border radius to 40 pixels. All right, so here we have a button without a skin. So let's define a few skin classes. The first one is btn, primary. Here we're going to set the background to color primary and the text to white. Then we're going to define the secondary buttons. So here I'm going to set the background to secondary color and the text color to white as well. Now you might say, wouldn't that be better to define this property in the button element itself? We can certainly do that to remove the duplication, but I like to keep this close to the background color so we can see both the text and background color in one place. And logically, this is really about skinning. So we want to separate the structure from the skin, right? Now, the third skin class is btn accent. Let's set the background to the accent color and the text color as well. Good. So take a look. That looks beautiful. Now let's test our other classes. So back to our markup, I'm going to use our secondary button. This is working, beautiful. And finally, our accent buttons. Always test your code as you go. Don't assume that your code is always going to work. So our buttons are working. Now back to our markup, sometimes we want to apply these classes to anchor elements. So let's see if our buttons still work. So I'm going to add an anchor with 2 classes. And let's set the label to buy now. All right, seems to be working. Now look at the mouse pointer when I hover it over the anchor. We see the hand, right? But this doesn't happen on the button. I would like to have the same pointer when we hover our mouse over button elements. This makes them look clickable. So here in the button class, we add a new property called cursor. We set it to pointer. Good. Now one more property I want to add is white space. I want to set it to no wrap. So in case we have limited space, I don't want the text in the button to wrap onto a second line. And the last step is to sort these lines so our code is nice and clean. Beautiful. So we're done with this step. Now let's implement the hover effect. So for each of these classes, I want to define a hover state right next to them. So primary, hover. Now, what should we set the background to? Well, our design doesn't currently show the hover effect of orange buttons. So here we have to use the eye picker, select this color, then bring up the color picker panel and manually select a different color. I'm going to brighten it a little bit and then copy this value. Now, where should we store this value? Well, there are a few options. We can define them in our color palette, but that's going to add some noise to our color palette. The other option is to add them here. But with this, we're going to have some colors defined in our color palette and some other colors defined in various places. So neither of these approaches is ideal. My preference is to use CSS preprocessors like Sass and Less. With Sass, we have a function called lighten. So we can call this function, give it our primary color, and then say lighten this up by 10%. When we compile our code, eventually this line of code is going to be replaced with an actual color value. So with this method, we're still going to have a single place where we have defined our primary color, that is our color palette. And whenever we need variations of this color, we can use the functions that come with Sass, like lighten and darken. Now, Sass requires its own course. It's not something I can cover in this course, but I'm planning to create a comprehensive course on Sass in the future. Maybe by the time you're watching this, my Sass course is ready as well. So for now, I'm just going to go with a hard-coded value here because I don't want to pollute our color palette. And I'm assuming that it's unlikely that we're going to redesign this website with completely new colors. So I'm happy with this. Now for our secondary buttons. Once again, we're going to define another rule. And here I'm going to set the background to, let me look at my cheat sheet. So that's going to be 00C8EB in case you want to use the same color. And finally, for our accent buttons, we're going to set the background to EC3000. Good. Now let's take a look. So everything is working. Let's also test the hover effect on primary and secondary buttons. Again, always test your code. Don't make any assumptions. Oops, did you see what happened? This is exactly what I was talking about. I made a mistake. So back to our style sheet. For our primary buttons in the hover state, I'm going to use 3A, 8FFD. That's a lighter blue. Then we have the secondary buttons. And for accent buttons, we have this lighter orange. Good. Let's test it one more time. That is working. The difference is really subtle. Now you can pick a different value. That's totally fine. That's not our focus here. So we're done with these skins. The next skin we're going to implement is for block buttons. So let's define a new class called btn _block. We're going to set the width to 100%. And we should also set display to inline block because anchor elements are inline by default. And if you give them a width, that's not going to work. So we have to change the display to inline block. Now I'm going to make both these buttons block buttons. So btn block and btn block. Great. Now look, for anchor elements, our text is not in the center. And also the button is wider than the screen. Why is this happening? Well, because we haven't set box sizing. So the horizontal padding that we have set is added on top of 100%. That is why this particular button is wider than the screen. Now, the reason this is not happening to our button element is because by default, browsers set box sizing of button elements to border box. So back to our structure. To make sure that the text is always in the center of the button, we have to apply text align and set it to center. Good. That problem is solved. Now the sizing problem. Back to our style sheet. On the top, we're going to define a rule using the universal selector. So we're going to grab all elements as well as all elements that are dynamically inserted after or before them. For these, we're going to set box sizing to border box. If you're not familiar with this concept, you need to go back, watch the second part of this series. I covered this in detail. Now let's see if the problem is solved. Okay, great. So we have built these buttons in isolation and they seem to be working fine. The last thing I want to add is some vertical margin to separate these from other elements. So back to our button class. Here we can apply a margin of 1 rem and 0. So 1 rem vertical and 0 horizontal. That's better. So we're done with the mobile version. Now the desktop version. That's pretty easy. We just need to reduce the font size. So at the end, we define a media query for screens that are wider than 1024 pixels. Here we're going to set the font size for our buttons to, what should we use here? Well, back to our design. Here's the standard version. Look at the size of this font. This is 15 pixels, okay? Now, look at this button over here. This one is 15 pixels as well. Now, look at this button. This one is 14 pixels. So you will encounter issues like this in a real design. Again, sometimes these are accidental. Sometimes they're deliberate. I don't think 1 pixel difference is going to be the end of the world. So I'm going to go with 15 pixels consistently. So let's set this to 1.5 rems. Now, here's the mobile version and here's the desktop version. Great. Actually, I just realized that I forgot to implement outline buttons. So let's look at my implementation real quick. We have 2 rules here, btn outline, where we set the background to white, the color to the same color we use for our headings, and we apply a border of 2 pixels in the same color. We have another rule for the hover effect, where we set the background to the same color we use for our headings, and we make the text white. All right, let's talk about implementing an input component. So look at this input component here. This input component is a special kind of input component because it contains a button. But not every input component is supposed to have a button, right? So in this lesson, we're going to implement a basic input component. Once it's ready, then in the next lesson, we'll combine it with a button to get this look. Also, this input component has a shadow around it. That's why its background looks white, but the rest of the page looks really light gray. The page is actually white. The reason we have some gray here is because of the shadow that is spilled around this input component. But once again, we don't want to add this shadow to every input component because that's going to make our page messy. Imagine a form with 5 input components, each having a shadow around it. So in our basic implementation, we just want to add a border. Then we'll customize that input component for this part of the page. So back to our markup, let's add an input of type text and give it a class of input. Now, back to our style sheet, let's define a new section called inputs. And here we define a new rule. What properties do we need here? Well, I'm going to apply a padding of 1.5 rems and 3.5 rems, a border of 1 pixel solid CCC, which is a really light gray. Then I'm going to give it a border radius of 30 pixels, so we get round corners. Now let's save the changes and see what we get up to this point. All right, here's what we get. That looks pretty decent. Now, I don't like this blue border that Chrome adds. This is called the outline. To get rid of this, we simply set the outline property to 0. Now, the border is gone. Great. Now, what if we type something here? By default, the text is black, but I want to change this to the same color we use for our headings. So we set the color to color headings. That's better. Now in this design, we have this placeholder here. So let's add it to our markup. So placeholder, we set it to enter domain name here. Now take a look. There are a couple of issues here. First, the text is a little bit larger than what we had in our design, and also it's darker. How can we change the color of the placeholder? Well, we have a special pseudo element selector for it. That is :placeholder. Here we're going to set the color to CD, CB, D7. Now, take a look. That is better. Now, the next problem is the font size. In this design, the font used here is Inter Light 20 pixels. Now, let's inspect this element and find the font size here. So we go to the Computer tab and look at the font size. That is 24 pixels. And as you can see, this is coming from normalized CSS. We don't want that. So back to our rule, let's set the font size to 2 rems. Now we have so many properties, so let's sort them all. That is better. Good. All right, here's what we get. I think that looks pretty decent. Now, if you look at the desktop version, you can see the font size here is 15 pixels. So the last thing we want to do here is defining a media query for wider screens. And here we're going to set the font size for inputs to 1.5 rems. So here's the mobile version. Now let's look at the desktop version. Okay, great. So our input component is ready. Next, I'm going to show you how to combine it with the button. So our input component is ready. Now we need to put a button inside this input component. How can we do this? Well, there is a special trick here. What you see here is not an input component. It's giving you the illusion of an input component. In reality, we have a div or a container. Inside this div, we have 2 elements, an input field or an input component and a button. The input component here doesn't have any borders. The actual border is applied to the div, to the container. So to implement this layout, you're going to wrap this element inside a div with the class of input-group. Let's move it right here. And then next to that, we're going to add a button with 2 classes, btn and btn accent. And the label is search. Now let's implement the input group class. So with this class, we can group an input field or an input component with something else. In this example, we are grouping it with a button, but we can also group it with an icon or any other elements. So back to our style sheet, let's define a new rule, input group. Now, this input group should have a border. So we set the border to 1 pixel solid CCC. This is the same color we use for our input component. So now it's a good opportunity to refactor this code and define this color somewhere global, so we don't have to repeat it in multiple places. So on the top, we go to our color palette and define a new color for borders, CCC. Now, let's find all occurrences of this color. So here's one instance. We're going to replace this with color border. Good. And one more time. All right. Back to our input group. So here we're going to use color border. Great. Now we should give this a border radius of 30 pixels. Again, we're using the same value that we used earlier over here. So we can refactor this and move it to somewhere global. So on the top, we define a new variable called border radius, and we set it to 30 pixels. Now, back to our input class, we're going to replace this with border radius. Great. And one more time for our input group. Border radius. Good. Let's see what we get up to this point. We get this weird layout, but don't worry, we're going to fix this in a second. First, we need to remove the border from this input component. This is where we need to use nesting. So when we are in an input group, if we have an input, that input shouldn't have a border. So we set the border to 0. Good. All right, the border is gone. The next problem is the placement of the button. The input group has stretched to take up all the available space because it's a div, it's a block level element, and that's how all block level elements behave. So to push the button to the right, we want to make this input field or this input component grow and take up all the available space. How can we do this? Well, we can use flex here. So back to our input group. Here we're going to set the display to flex. Now, this input component is a flex item, right? So here we can set flex grow to 1, and this will make this input field grow to take up all the available space. Now take a look. Great. Now my browser is a little bit larger than my recording window, so this is actually what we should get. Great. The next problem we need to fix is the margin around the button. So let's inspect this element. As you can see, there is a 10 pixel margin above and below our button. So back to our style sheet, we're going to define a new rule for buttons inside input groups. So input group and BTN. These buttons should have a margin of 4 pixels. I'm using an absolute value here because I don't want the margin to be dependent on the font size or the viewport size. I always want to have 4 pixels of margin. Now take a look. Okay, I think that looks much better. Now let's type something here, like a really long string. Okay, everything looks great. Now let me show you something really cool. Back to our markup. Inside this group, we have an input and a button, right? Now I can move the button and put it before the input field. And here's what we get. We can also replace the button with something else, like an icon. So let's pull up icons.html and grab our basic icon template. So copy this and drop it here. Good. Now take a look. We have an input field with an icon on the left side. We can also put an icon on the right side. All these combinations work. So this is the benefit of building these individual components in isolation. When we build and test all these components in isolation, then we can easily combine them to build complex pages. This is what we call the bottom-up approach. In contrast, with the top-down approach, we start at the page level and start building different elements. With this approach, we end up with weird layout issues, and sometimes troubleshooting these issues can be time-consuming. Now, one more thing before we finish this lesson. If we type something here, look, there's so much space between the text and the icon or the other element, whatever it is. So let's see where this space is coming from. I'm going to inspect this element. All right, look at our input field. This input field has 35 pixels left padding. So if an input field is inside an input group, I want to reduce the horizontal padding. So here we have a rule for input fields inside a group. Here I'm going to reduce the padding to 1.5 rems for vertical and 1 rem for horizontal padding. And here's what we get. I think that's much nicer. So we're done with our input components. Now it's time to store this template in our components folder. Then review our code and commit it to the repository. I will see you in the next lesson. All right, now let's see how we can implement the popular badge. This is very easy. All we have to do is insert an image in the header, and then using absolute positioning, we can position it to the top right corner of the card. As simple as that. Now, below this video, you can find this image as an SVG file. I didn't include it in the zip file because this file has the same problem as the logo file that I told you about earlier. The designer that I worked with, he didn't know much about vector graphics, so I asked him to export this a few times, and unfortunately, I couldn't put this in a sprite. Things didn't work the way I expected. I'm so sorry about the hassle, so please download this image, then add it to the images folder. Good. Now, if we go back to our markup, so here's the header of the card. We're going to add an image and set the source to images/popular SVG. Now, before going any further, let's preview our changes. So here's what we get. That looks awful. Now we can come back here and give this a class to style it, but let me show you a better way. I don't want to remember to add this element every time I want to make a plan popular. Wouldn't that be nicer if instead of adding this element, all we had to do was to apply a second class here like plan -- popular, because this is a variation of the plan component. This is just an extra skin. So let's use this class to dynamically insert that image. How are we going to do that? Using pseudo element selectors. So using the before selector, we want to insert an image before the content of the header element. So let's go to our style sheet. Before our media query, we're going to write another rule. So if you have a plan that is popular, we want to insert something before the content of the card header. So here we type card header, double colons before. We talked about this in the first part of the series. So here we're going to set the content to, using the URL function, we're going to load the image. So currently we are in the CSS folder. We have to go one level up, then to images and load popular SVG. Before going any further, let's make sure we're getting the same result as before. So save. Great. Now we can easily style this. So I'm going to set the width to 40 pixels. Now, because this is an inline element, we have to set display to inline block so the width works. Let's take a look. Great. Now using absolute positioning, we want to move it over here. So we're going to set position to absolute. And that means we should make the parent or the container a relatively positioned element. What is the parent? Card header. So let's define another rule. If you have a plan that is popular, the card header should be a relatively positioned element. So we set position to relative. Great. Now that we are using absolute positioning here, we're going to set top to 0 and right to 5%. So whatever the width of the card, we're going to take 5% of that and use it as the right offset. Now take a look. So here's what we get. I'm going to push this badge a little bit further up. So let's set the top to -6 pixels. That looks better. So here's the white version. We also have the mobile version. Everything looks great. So we're done with the plan component. Next, we're going to implement a media component. The next component we're going to build is the quote component, which is this part of the page. Now, what about the image? Shouldn't we include it in the quote component? No, we shouldn't. Imagine on this website, we're going to have articles about cloud computing. Now, in our articles, we might have quotes from others, but we don't necessarily need to show their photo, right? So a quote should only include some text and the name of the person and potentially the organization, nothing more. Once we build this component, then we'll combine it with an image. We'll put it inside the card and create a testimonial component, okay? So back to our markup. To represent a quote, we can either use the Q element, which is inline, or block quote, which is a block level element. Now I'm going to give this a class like quote. And inside this element, we're going to add a paragraph with some text. Okay. Now back to our style sheet. Let's define a new section, quotes. Here we define a new rule. Now back to our design. The text that we have here is slightly larger than the main body text. It's also darker and italic. So I'm going to set the font size to 3 rams. font style to italic, and color to 5C5577. Now, this is a good opportunity for us to refactor our code and store this color in our palette as the darker version of the body text. Potentially, we can reuse this in the future. So I'm going to cut this value from here. Now, on the top, in our color palette, here's the color for the body text. Let's define another color for body darker. Okay, now back to our new rule. We're going to set the color to color body darker. Good. Let's see what we get after this point. Here's what we get. That looks pretty good. The only problem I see here is the space between lines. Compare this with what we have over here. The lines are closer. So back to our style sheet, we can set the line height to 1.3. Now take a look. That's much better. Now, one thing that is missing here is the quotation marks. In our design mockup, we have the quotation marks before and after the text. I don't want to remember to type this every time we have a quote. I want to use pseudo element selectors to insert these dynamically. So using pseudo element selectors, we can insert content before and after the content of this paragraph element. But first we have to give it a class like quote, _, text. Now back to our style sheet, we define a new rule and say quote, _, text, ;, before. Here we're going to set the content to open quote. This is a predefined value in HTML. When we save the changes, we get the quotation mark over here. Now we need to add the closing quotation mark over here. So back to our style sheet, quote text, after, we're going to set the content to close quote. Take a look. Great. So we're done with the text. Now we need to add the name of the person. So back to our design mockup, look at this part of the page. Do you see a familiar pattern? Here we have the media pattern. On the left, we have an image or an icon. And on the right, we have a title followed by some text. So we can reuse our media component here. So back to our markup, after the paragraph element, we add a footer. So a footer doesn't necessarily belong to a page. It can be part of a section, an article, a component. It can be part of anything. So in the footer, we're going to add our media component. So let's open up the template for our media component, copy all this code, and then paste it over here. Now let's make the necessary changes. So here's the icon. Currently we are using the snap icon. I'm going to replace this with line. Next, for the title, we're going to type the name of the person. Let's say John Smith. And for the paragraph, we're going to type the name of the company. Let's say ABC Company. Let's see what we get up to this point. Okay, that's not too bad. Now we need to style the name of the person and the company. But how about you pause the video, you do this part of the job. When you're ready, come back, see my solution. So back to our markup, this is where we have the name of the person. I'm going to give this element an extra class like quote author. Now you might be asking why I'm not reusing the media title class. For example, couldn't we go to our style sheet and define a rule like quote, then media title to style the author? We can certainly do that, but the problem with this approach is that what if tomorrow we decide to drop the media component here and restructure this part? So I would prefer to use an independent class for styling the author. So back to our style sheet, let's change the rule to quote author. Now, what property is doing it here? I'm going to set the font size to 3 rams and font weight to 500. Let's see what we get up to this point. All right, here's what we have. The text is italic because we applied the italic style at the parent or at the container level. So for the author, we need to reset the style back to normal. So we set font style to normal. Take a look. Okay, that's better. Now the font that we have here is different from the font that we have in our design mockup. We talked about this earlier. This font we have here is Montserrat, but this is the only place where we have used this font. So I don't want to bring an extra font just to display the name of a person, at least not at this point in time. If we had that design for other pages of this website, then we could see if there are many other places where we are using this font. So for now, I don't want to worry about the difference between this font and what we're currently using. Now, for the company, look at the color. The color we're using here is the same color we have for our headings. But how come this text is very bright? This has to do with opacity. So earlier I told you that we can go to the window menu, then open up the layers. Now look at the opacity of this layer. It's 40%. So back to our markup, let's give this paragraph element a class like quote organization. We could also call it company, it doesn't matter. Now we define a new rule. Here we set the color to the same color we have for our headings, and we set the opacity to 0.4. We should also set the font size to 2 rems and font style to normal. Take a look. Okay, that's pretty close to our design mockup. The only problem is the space between these elements. They're currently a little bit too far apart, and this is coming from the bottom margin of this element. So back to the rule for the author element, I'm going to remove the margin bottom. Good. That's pretty good. Now, one last thing we need to change here is the position of this line. If you compare this with the design mockup, look, this line is currently aligned with the middle of the text. But in our implementation, the line is below the text. How can we position this? Well, there are a few different solutions. The simplest solution is to use relative positioning. So we can position this element relative to itself without affecting other elements. So back to our markup. First, I want to assign our SVG element a separate class like quote line. Again, I want to separate the elements of the quote component from the icons. So back to our style sheet, we define a new rule and say our quote line should be relatively positioned, position relative, and we're going to give it a bottom of, let's say, 10 pixels. Here's what we get. That's very close to our design mockup. The last thing that is left here is adjusting the font size for wider screens. So we define a new media query for wider screens and set the font size for quotes to 2 rems. For quote author, we're going to use 2.4 rems. And finally, for organization, we're going to use 1.6 rems. So font size, 1.6 rems. Now, back to the browser. Here's the mobile version and here's the desktop version. Great. So we're done with this component. I will see you in the next lesson. The next component we're going to implement is the grid component. So earlier I told you that there are many places on this page where we need a 2-column grid. Here's one example. Here we have a 2-column grid. In the first column, we have the image. In the second column, we have some content. Here's another example. Once again, an image and some content. And one more time. So if we build this grid component, we can reuse it to build all these layouts. Now, this is the standard version of our design. If you look at the mobile version, you can see that we always have a single column grid. So back to our markup, we're going to add a div with the class of grid. Now we're going to have variations of this grid. We're going to have a 2-column grid, a 3-column grid, and so on. So we're going to add a second class, and we can call this grid, double hyphens. Now we can call the variation calls -2, or we can call it 1 times 2, like 1 row, 2 columns. Now you might argue that in a 2-column grid, if we have more than 2 items, a new row will be implicitly created. That's absolutely right. However, I personally like this convention more because I'm going to use this only for 1 row of elements. So 1 row, 2 columns. Now, if you don't like this convention, you can use calls -2. That's totally fine. So 1 times 2, we have this markup. Now, in this div, only for this demo, I'm going to create 2 divs with different background colors, simulating different elements. So these divs can represent an image or this content over here. So back to our markup, we're going to add 2 divs. And for this demo only, I'm going to apply an inline style because we're going to throw these away. These divs are not going to be part of our component. Okay. So let's set the style to. First, I'm going to give them a height so we can see them. Otherwise, the height is 0. Then we're going to set the background For the first one, I'm going to use gold. And for the second one, I'm going to use Dodger blue. Let's see what we have up to this point. So these elements are laid out vertically, and this is exactly what we want on mobile. Now, for 2-column grids, starting from tablets, we want to put them side by side. So here our style sheet. Let's define a new section called grids. First, we're going to define the rule for the grid class. And here we're going to set the display to grid. Now, for tablets, we're going to change the template of the grid to 2 columns. So here we write a media query and saying if the screen is wider than 768 pixels, this is kind of a standard breakpoint that a lot of frameworks like Bootstrap use. But again, these breakpoints are not set in stone. We can always change them when we build the final page. So for now, let's define a new rule here. Grid, double hyphens, 1 times 2. So this class only comes to existence for screens that are wider than 768 pixels, like tablets. Now, here we're going to set grid template columns to 1FR, 1FR. So we're going to take all the available space, divide it by 2, and then give each column 1 slice, okay? We could also rewrite this using the repeat function, repeat to 1FR. That's another way. Now let's see what we get. So on mobile, our items are laid out vertically. Now starting from tablets, they appear right next to each other. Great. So we're done with the 2-column grid. Now as an exercise, I want you to implement a 3-column grid. For 3-column grids, we want to put the items side by side only on wide screens, not tablets, not mobiles. So laptops and wider screens. So pause the video, do this exercise, then come back see my solution. All right, the implementation is super easy. We just have to duplicate this rule, then change the breakpoint to 1024 pixels. And we're going to call this class grid 1 by 3. Then we're going to change this to 3 columns. So on wide screens, our grid is going to have 3 columns, but on any screens that are below 1024 pixels, our grid is going to have only a single column. Now, back to our markup to test this. We're going to change this to 1 by 3. Then we're going to add another element and set the background to, let's say, tomato. So here's a mobile version. Now we get to tablet and then to wide screens. Great. All right, now we have all the building blocks we need to create the testimonial component. So back to our markup, we're going to start with a card. Inside the card, we're going to have a grid, a 2-column grid. So grid, double hyphen, 1 by 2. Good. Now inside the grid, we have an image and a code component. First, I'm going to add the image. So in the zip file that I gave you at the beginning of this section, you can find the testimonial image in the images folder. Let's drag and drop this onto the images folder. Good. Now we're going to set the source to images/testimonial. Now, as a best practice, we should always set the alt attribute of our images. So what does this image represent? A happy, smiling customer. So we can say a happy, smiling customer. Good. Now, after the image, we have a code component, but I don't want to bring the code component yet. I don't want to bring too much complexity. I want to build this step by step. So temporarily, I want to add a div and give it an inline style. I'm going to give it a height of 100 pixels and a background of gold. Let's make sure that we get the basics right. Then we'll come back and replace this div with a code component. So here's what we get. Now let's resize the browser. Look, the size of the image is not changing. So we're dealing with a fixed size image. Now the problem with this is that at certain breakpoints, we're not going to have an equal distribution of columns. We're not going to have 2 columns, each taking half of the page. Take a look. So on my machine, at this breakpoint, look, right here, at 770 pixels. Can you tell that the image is larger than the second column? So how can we fix this problem? Well, we want to make this image responsive. So currently, our image has a width of 400 pixels. We haven't said this explicitly. This is just the dimension of the image. Now, if we give this image a width of 100%, that means 100% of its container. So if the container becomes larger or smaller, our image will resize accordingly. So here in our markup, we're going to give this image a class. What are we going to call this class? Testimonial __ image. And that means we should also apply this class here. So this is the main element that represents our component. Okay. Now let's open up our style sheet and define a new section for testimonials. First, I'm going to define a rule for our testimonial and apply a padding of 3 rems. Because in this design, we have some padding around the content of the grid. Okay. Next, we're going to define a rule for our testimonial image. And here we're going to set the width to 100%. Now take a look. So we have equal distribution of columns. And if we resize the browser, our image also gets resized. And at all times, we always have 2 equal columns. Great. So we have solved the first problem. Now, currently, I cannot see the boundary of our card. So I want to go to our markup and temporarily apply a padding to our body element so we have less space for the card and we can see the actual card. So over here, just as a temporary solution, we're going to set an inline style to apply some padding. Again, we don't want to do this for any serious projects. So here's what we get. We can clearly see our card. Great. Now, the next thing we want to add is this icon. Now, how are we going to implement this? Well, this icon should always be in this position. So here we want to use absolute positioning. And to achieve that, we want to put this image and the icon inside a container, which is relatively positioned. Then we'll apply absolute positioning on the icon. So it's always in this location. So here's our image element. We're going to put this inside a container with a class of, what are we going to call this? Well, we can call this testimonial image. Now, what's going to happen to the actual image? Well, we're going to remove this class from the image. And then back to our style sheet, we have to make a tiny change here. We're going to target the image that is directly inside this container. So image. So see, this is a good case for using the direct child selector. In the second part of this series, I told you that most of the time you shouldn't avoid this because you don't want your CSS to know about your markup, because if the markup changes, then you'll have to come back and update the CSS as well. But I believe this is like an exceptional case because it's very unlikely that we're going to change the structure of this container. If you don't like this approach, you can come back here and give this container a different class like testimonial image container, and then apply the testimonial image class to the image element. That's another solution. But I think that would be too many classes. So I'm just going to go with the direct child selector. Let's make sure everything works up to this point. So I'm going to resize the browser and we have a responsive image. Great. Now we're going to add the icon and use absolute positioning. So first we need to enable relative positioning on the container, which is testimonial image. Here we're going to set the position to relative. Good. Now to add the icon, we're going to pull up our icon template and copy this markup. Now back to index.html. I'm going to add the icon right after the image. Good. Now to position the icon container, once again, I'm going to use the direct child selector. Again, we could give this a separate class, but I find this unnecessary. So we're going to define another rule and say, in our testimonial image, we're going to target the icon container and set its position property to absolute. Then we're going to set the top to, let's say 3 rems and right to 0. Let's see what we get up to this point. Okay, here's our icon. Now we need to shift it to the right. Now I want you to pay attention to something. If you look at the design mockup, the right edge of the image is exactly in the middle of the icon, in the middle of the circle. How can we guarantee this? Well, for sizing these icons, we have used pixels, which are absolute values. So earlier we set the size of this icon to 64 pixels. So if we divide this by 2, we'll get 32 pixels. We can use that as an offset to correctly position the icon. So back to our new rule. Instead of setting the right to 0, we're going to set the right offset to 32 pixels. That is 64 divided by 2. All right, now look. Well, our icon moved to the left, so we have to use a negative value here. So back to our style sheet, let's use negative 32 pixels. And now our icon is exactly in the right position. And this is not dependent on the size of the screen. So if I make my browser wider or more narrow, our icon is always in the right location. Now, what about the color? Well, we can create variations of this icon container. So we can give it different skins. So back to the icon section of our style sheet, this is where we defined the basic icon container rule. We're going to define a skin for this component. We can say icon container, double hyphens, accent. So here we're going to use our accent color. We set the background to color accent. Good. Now we can use this new class in our testimonial. So here's icon container. We're going to add the second class, which is icon container accent. Let's make sure it works. Great. Now we need to change the color of the icon to blue. Once again, we're going to create a variation of the icon class. So here's our SVG element. Currently, we're using icon primary, which displays the icon in blue. We're going to create a new class called icon white. So back to our style sheet. This is where we define the icon primary rule. Now let's define a new rule, icon white, and here we set fill to white. Good. Now we can apply this new class over here. Perfect. Now one last thing is to replace the WordPress icon with quotes. Let's take a look. Perfect. The only problem is the size of the icon. If you compare it with our design mockup, you can see the icon here is a little bit smaller. So once again, we can create another variation of the icon class. So once again, in the icon section, we're going to define another skin and call it icon small. Here we can set the width to 30 pixels and height to 30 pixels as well. Now, back to our markup, we're going to apply that class right here, icon small. Let's see. That looks great to me. We're almost done. The last part is adding the quote component. So back to index.html. This is where we added that temporary div. I'm going to delete this line. Now, let's go to the template for our codes, copy all this code, and then paste it right here. Now, let's verify. Good. The only problem I have here is the size of the font for a screen of this size. So what is the breakpoint here? It's around 800 pixels. If you go wider than 1024 pixels, the font becomes smaller. But for tablets, I think the font is a little bit too big and we don't have enough words on each line. So here in the testimonial section, we're going to define a new media query for tablets. Once again, we're going to use the standard breakpoint. And here we're going to set a few rules. The first one is for a quote inside a testimonial component. So our quote should have a font size of 2.1 rems. Let's take a look. That's better. We have more text on each line, but the name of the author is way too big. I want to use the same font size for the author. So let's just reuse this style for testimonial, quote, author. See, this is the benefit of BEM convention. We can clearly see the components and their elements. Now, back here, that looks good. Now, if you look at our design mockup, you can see we have more space here. We can implement this by adding a left margin to our quote component. So over here, we're going to define another rule, testimonial quote, and we're going to apply a left margin of 6 rems. Take a look. Okay, that's better. And everything looks great for white screens. And on mobile, we get a one column layout. So we can spend more time on customizing this and making sure it looks great. For example, currently our icon is a little bit cut off. This is because of the overflow that we applied to the cart component early on. I'm not going to spend any more time on this because it's going to be repetitive. So I'm going to leave it up to you to fine tune this component. All right, the next component we're going to implement is the callout component. Now on the surface, this kind of looks like our cart component, but there are a couple of differences. The first difference is that this component doesn't have any shadows. The second difference is that the entire component has a background color, But in our implementation of the card component, we assume that a card can have a header and a body, and it's only the header that can have a background color. Now, to reuse the card component here, we'll have to put all this content inside the card header, but this is semantically incorrect because we don't have a header section here. So I can go back and revisit the card component and make it more flexible, but that's going to be a little bit confusing for you because I have to make sure that any changes I apply there are not going to break the existing component. So instead of going back and forth, I'm going to create a brand new component here. Now, you might think this is a very simple component and you may want to skip this lesson, but trust me, there are a few tricky parts here, so watch this lesson to the end. So on desktop, we have a 2-column grid, and on mobile, we have a 1-column grid. So back to index.html, we're going to add a div with 2 classes, callout and callout _primary for giving it that particular background color. Inside this component, we're going to have a grid. Well, a 2-column grid. So we add the second class, 1 by 2. Good. Now, inside the grid, we're going to have 2 items. So we have 2 columns. In the first column, we have some content, which includes a heading and some text. And in the second column, we have a button. So in this grid, we're going to have 2 items. The first one is a div. We can give it a class like callout _content. This is the div that wraps a heading and a paragraph. So we can say ready to get started. And then we add the paragraph with some words. Good. So this is our first item that goes in the first column. Then we're going to add the second item, which is a button. Now, more accurately, this is going to be an anchor element because when the user clicks on this button, they should go to a different page. So we add an anchor with 2 classes, btn and btn secondary. Now we're going to say get started. Good. Now let's work on styling. So we go to our style sheet and create a new section, callouts. Here's our first rule. For the callout component, we're going to apply some padding and a border radius of 5 pixels. Now to give it the primary color, we create the second rule, callout primary, and here we set the background to the primary color. And of course, we want to make the text white so it stands out. Let's test our implementation up to this point. Holy cow, what happened to our button? Don't worry, we're going to fix it in a second. First, let's work on the content. So the heading is dark blue. We have to turn it to white. And we have some extra space over here, which is coming from the top margin of the heading. So back to our markup. Here's our h2 element. We're going to give it a class, callout _heading. Now, back to our style sheet. Let's define a rule for our heading. We're going to set the color to white and remove the top margin. So we can say margin top is 0. We should also set the font size to 3 rams. That is based on what we have on mobile. So here's what we get. I think that looks pretty good. Now, what is going on with the button? Well, this has to do with the alignment of items in a grid. So let's say we have a grid. Temporarily, I'm just going to create this rule. If this is a grid, here we have 2 properties for aligning items. We have justify items for horizontal alignment and align items for vertical alignment. Now, the default value of these properties is stretch. So that is the reason why this button has stretched horizontally and vertically. Now, to solve this problem, we have to change the alignment of this button. So let's get rid of this temporary rule. We're going to define a new rule for buttons in a callout component. Here I'm going to set align self to center. So instead of justify items, which should be applied to the grid, we're going to use justify self. This is a property we apply to a grid item. So horizontally, where should we place this? Back to our mobile version, the button should be horizontally in the center. So we set this to center. Now, what about vertical alignment? For that, instead of align items, which we apply to a grid, we're going to use align self. Now, what value should we use here? Back to the desktop version, vertically, this button should be in the center. So we set this to center as well. Now, take a look. Okay, the problem is solved. Now, let me make the browser smaller so we see the actual mobile version. So our text alignment is not right here because on mobile, the counter is center aligned. But here we have left alignment. So earlier we defined this div, call out content, which wraps an H2 and a paragraph. We're going to define a rule for this element. So we say call out __ content. Here we're going to set text align to center. Good. So here's what we get. I think this is very close to what we have in our design mockup. The only difference is that this button has extra horizontal padding. Now we can come back to this rule for buttons in a callout. We can apply the padding here, but this is not a reusable solution. What if somewhere else in a different component, we want to have a button with more horizontal padding? Object-oriented CSS says that we should separate content from container. So instead of applying the padding here, we're going to define a reusable class or a reusable skin for our buttons. So let's go to the button section. Okay. Here we're going to define a new class or a new skin for our buttons. I'm going to call that btn _ long. Or a better name is stretched. So here I'm going to apply a padding left of 6 rems and a padding right of 6 rems. Now that we have this reusable class, we can apply it in our markup. So this is where we have our button. I'm going to add the second class, which is btn stretched. Good. Let's take a look. That's what we get. This is very close to our mobile version. Great. Now, what about desktop version? Well, earlier we defined a breakpoint of 768 for tablets. From this breakpoint onward, we have to change the alignment of content. So instead of center aligned, we want to use left aligned. So back to the styles of the callout component, we're going to define a new media query for screens that are wider than 768 pixels. Here we're going to define a new rule for callout content and set text align to left. That is the first improvement. So that's better. Now for tablets or wider screens, we don't want the button to be horizontally in the center because it will be separated from the content. We want it to be close to the content. So we want to push it to the left side of the horizontal axis. How do we do that? Back to our media query, we define a new rule for callout btn. And here we set justify self, which is a property we apply to a grid item. We set it to start. So earlier we set this to center for mobile. Now we set it to start. Now take a look. Okay, the button is closer, but we need to give it some margin. So I'm going to give it a horizontal margin of 2 rems. Take a look. That is better. Now, the other problem we have here is that we have 2 columns. Each is taking 50% of the page. So we have so much space wasted over here. Wouldn't that be nicer if the content column would stretch and take up all the extra space? Let me show you how to do that. So back to our media query, I'm going to define a new rule for our grid. So in our callout component, if we have a grid that is 1 by 2, we're going to change the template of this grid. So we set grid template columns. Previously, we set this to 1FR and 1FR. That is why we got 2 columns with equal width, but we don't want that. So for the second column, we're going to use auto, and this will make the column get wide enough to fit the button. All the extra space will be allocated to the first column. Take a look. Okay, look, the first column has stretched and the second column is now smaller. If I make my browser wider, look, the first column keeps stretching and getting more space. Great. So here's the mobile version and here's the version for tablets and desktops. Everything looks great. So let's move on to the next lesson. Now look at the links in the footer in the mobile version of our website. Here we have collapsible sections. So we can click on this section to expand or collapse it. So before we build the footer component, we want to build a reusable, collapsible component. Now, what do we need here? Well, every collapsible component should have two sections, a header and a body or content area. When we click on the header, the content expands or collapses. Now, in the header, we have two elements, a heading, which can be an H2, an H3, or any kind of heading element, and an icon. So back to index.html, let's add a div with the class of collapsible. Now, in this div, we're going to have a header, which can include an H2, let's say item 1, and an icon. So let's pull up our icons template, copy all this code, then bring it here. Now, we're going to replace the icon with chevron. So here's the header section. And right after that, we have the content section. So we add a div with a class of collapsible, _, content. And here we can have anything. It doesn't have to be a list of links. We can simply have a paragraph of text, okay? So let's see what we get up to this point. All right, there are a few things we need to improve. First, we need to put the chevron over here. How can we do that? Using flex. So as you know, using flex, we can lay out items horizontally or vertically. So back to our markup, here's our header element. I'm going to give it a class called collapsible, _, header. Now we're going to use flex in this element. So back to our style sheet, let's define a new section for collapsibles. Now we add a new rule, collapsible header. Here we should set the display to flex. Let's see what we get. Good. Now we have some space over here. This is coming from the top margin of the heading. So back to our markup. Here's our heading. I'm going to give this a class. Let's say collapsible heading. Now in the future, we can replace this H2 with an H3 or any other kind of element. As long as we have this class, everything is going to work. So let's copy this. Now we define a new rule for our heading and set the top margin to 0. Now take a look. That's better. Now I want to push the chevron to the right side of the container. So back to our header, we're going to set justify content to space between. This will push the items to the edges of the container and add space between that. So here's what we get. Great. Now, in this implementation, we are not applying a width to our collapsible because we want our collapsible to be responsive and fluid. So we can put it in any container and the actual width will be determined by the container. Now, the next thing I want to do is to reduce the size of the heading. So here's the heading element. Let's set the font size to 3 rems. That's better. Now, there are a couple of problems with our icon. First, it has a container, which we don't need. And second, the icon is blue. We want to change that to white. So back to our markup. Here we have a span with the class of icon container. We're going to remove this and just use an SVG. Okay. Now for the color, we're going to use icon white. Okay, great. Now a collapsible can be in two states. It's either collapsed or expanded. In this implementation, our collapsible is expanded. So we see the content and the chevron is pointing down. Now I want to change this implementation and make the collapsible initially collapsed. Then when we click on this icon, the collapsible will expand, okay? So there are a couple of things we need to do. First, we need to turn the chevron so it points to the right. So we have to rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise. And then we need to hide the content area. So back to our markup. Here's the icon for the chevron. I'm going to give this an extra class, collapsible chevron. I don't want to rely on this icon class because maybe in the content area, we're going to have some other icons. So I don't want to apply a style to all icons in a collapsible. That's why I defined an extra class. Now let's style this. So we define a new rule, and using the transform property, we rotate this 90 degrees counterclockwise. Take a look. That looks good. Next, we need to hide the content area. So earlier we defined a class for the content area that is collapsible content. So I'm going to copy this and define a rule for it here. So here we set display to none. Good. So now our collapsible is collapsed. So let's implement the expanded state. Back to our markup. Here's our collapsible component. We're going to define a new class, let's say collapsible double hyphen expanded. So this is a modifier for a collapsible. Now, if we have this class at the top level, then we're going to rotate the chevron so it points down, and we're going to show the content area. So back to our style sheet, we define a new rule. If we have a collapsible that is expanded, the chevron should point down. So once again, using the transform property, we rotate it to 0, which is its initial position. Let's verify it's working. Great. Now using the same technique, we're going to show the content area. So we use nesting one more time. If we have an expanded collapsible, then the content area should be visible. So we set display to block. Take a look. Great. We're almost there. Now let me show you something really cool. So let's inspect this element. Now look at this element. It's currently expanded, right? Now if you double click here and remove the expanded class, let's change it to something else. It doesn't matter. Our collapsible collapsed. Did you see that? We can expand it by adding this class back. So now what we need to do is to use JavaScript to dynamically insert this class when the user clicks on the header. Now, since this is the third part of my HTML and CSS series, I didn't want to assume the knowledge of JavaScript to take this course. So if you don't know JavaScript, don't worry at all. I've already created the code for you. It's only a few lines of code. So in the zip file that I gave you at the beginning of the course, we have this code folder where you can find the completed code. Here we have Moshify, and we have a folder called JS, which is short for JavaScript. All I want you to do now is to add this folder to your project. So we're going to drag and drop this folder over here and then select copy folder. Good. So now we have a JavaScript file. Let me review the JavaScript code real quick. So here we have main.js. All we are doing here is using the document object, which is a reference to the current page, to query and find all elements that have the collapsible class. Now we get all those elements, store them here. Then using the for each method, we can iterate over them. We get each item, and then using this method, add event listener, we register a function to be called when that item is clicked. In other words, with this piece of code, we're going to find all collapsible elements, and when the user clicks on them, we're going to execute some code. What is that code? It's right here. We're going to the list of classes for that element and toggle this particular class, collapsible expanded. So if this class exists, we're going to remove it. Otherwise, we're going to add it. Now, the final code that I'm going to supply might be a little bit different from what you see here because I haven't completed the project. So don't worry if there are a few more lines before or after this code. This is the main concept. Now, if you want to learn JavaScript, I have a few JavaScript courses on my website, so you can learn them after this course. Now, we have a JavaScript file. Back to index.html. Down the bottom, before we close the body element, we're going to add a script element. So script, tab. Here we set the source attribute to js/main.js. Now, the reason we add JavaScript code at the end of our HTML document is that we don't want this JavaScript code to hold the rendering of our page. So we want the page to quickly render, and then the browser is going to download and execute our JavaScript file. Okay. So with this, now we can go back to our browser and click on the header to expand or collapse this component. Beautiful. Now, one last touch. We want to add an interesting animation here. Back to the rule for our chevron. As you can see, we're using the transform property to change the direction of the chevron. Now, we can use the transition property to make this transformation smooth. So we want to animate this property. We say the transform should happen within 0.3 seconds. Now take a look. Click. Beautiful. Now, we need one more animation for the content area, but there's a problem here. For the content area, we're setting the display to none or block depending on the state of the collapsible. Unfortunately, we cannot animate this property. So we cannot say transition display 0.3 seconds. Nothing is going to happen. So I'm going to show you a trick. Instead of the display property, we're going to set the maximum height of this element to 0. Now, why aren't we using the height property? I'll talk about that in a second. So we're going to use max height. Now, with the height of 0, we're going to have overflow. So the content will still be visible no matter what state the collapsible is in, because we have overflow. So to hide the content, we have to set overflow to hidden. Now, when we are in the collapse state, the content area is invisible. So initially we set the height to 0 and overflow to hidden. When the user expands the collapsible, then we're going to change these two properties. So we're going to set max height to 100 VH. With this, we're saying that the height of the content area can be maximum of 100% of the height of the viewport. So we are allowing it to stretch vertically, but it's not going to stretch more than its content because we're using the max height property. If instead we use the height property and set it to 100 VH, the content area would take up the entire height of the viewport. This is not what we want. That is why we use max height. So this is the limit that we're going to apply, but the actual height will be determined by the content of this element, okay? Now, back to the first rule for the content area. Here we want to apply the transition property. Which property are we animating? Max height. So max height should change in 0.3 seconds. Now take a look. Expand. See that? Nice. Now we can make this even better. Back to the first rule, when the content area is hidden, we can set the opacity to 0. And then when the content area is expanded, we can set the opacity back to 1. Now take a look. Okay, we don't see any changes because this is the only property that we're animating. So to animate multiple properties, we can use all. Now see the difference. Do you see that nice fade out effect? That looks beautiful. We're pretty much done. Now let's take this collapsible and duplicate it to see what it looks like in a real scenario. So I'm going to take this entire div that represents our collapsible and duplicate it. Now save the changes. Take a look. So we have two collapsibles. It looks beautiful. Now, obviously, this looks nothing like the links in the footer. But at this point, we don't want to worry about styling this collapsible. We can always add that as a skin later. The whole purpose of the lesson was to create the structure for a collapsible component. This dark background that we have here and this kind of grayish text, these are really the styles that we need to apply to the footer component. I don't think we're going to have another collapsible somewhere else on this website with the exact same look. That's why I think this is probably the style of the collapsible inside a footer component. So later when we build the footer, we'll come back and revisit these styles. All right, now we're going to implement the navigation bar. This is a little bit tricky and quite interesting. So on desktop, we have the logo on the left and the menu items on the right. And these menu items are laid out horizontally. In contrast, on mobile, we have the logo and this button, which we can call a toggler. When we click on the toggler, the menu items should appear vertically below the navigation bar. So how are we going to implement this? Well, here's the trick. In this navigation bar, we're going to have three elements: a logo, the toggler button, which is invisible on desktop, and an unordered list. So we're going to have three items in the navigation bar. Now, to lay this out horizontally, we're going to use flex in our navigation bar. Now, as you know, when we put items in a flex container, by default, they shrink so they can appear in one line. Now, on mobile, we want these menu items to appear on the second line, below the navigation bar. So how are we going to achieve this? Well, we're going to give this list a width of 100%, which means 100% of the width of its parent, which is the entire navigation bar. So this list is going to stretch. Then we're going to enable wrapping in our flex container. So this item or this unordered list will appear on the second line. Now, in terms of the behavior, this navigation bar is another collapsible component. So when we click on this button, our navigation bar expands. And if it's already expanded, it will collapse. So we're not going to write any new JavaScript code for implementing this navigation bar. We're going to reuse the existing code. This is another benefit of bottom-up or component-based approach. So back to VS Code. First, we need to add this logo file to our project. You can find this in the icons folder of the zip that I gave you at the beginning of the course. So let's add the logo. Good. Now, we're going to go to index.html. First, we're going to add a nav element and give it the class of nav for styling. Now, inside this nav, we're going to have 3 elements: the logo, the toggler button, and the list of items. So we're going to wrap the logo inside an anchor. So when the user clicks on it, they go to the homepage of the website. So we add an anchor, and inside this anchor, we need an image. Good. Now, for the href attribute, we're going to use a / to represent the root of the website. And for the image source, we're going to use images/logo.svg. Good. So this was our first element. Now the second element, the toggler button. For that, we need an icon. So let's pull up the template for our icons. So here we're using an icon container, but in the navigation bar, we don't need a round container. We just need the icon. So let's grab this SVG element and paste it here. Next, we're going to change the icon from WordPress to menu. And we should change the color from primary to white. Good. And now the third element, we need an unordered list. Now I want to give this element the list class that we defined earlier in the course. With this, we get rid of the bullet points and the left padding. Now, here we need a bunch of list items. Each list item should have an anchor. So I'm going to set the href just to a pound. We can always change that later. And for the label, I'm going to use hosting. Now let's duplicate this a few times. The second link is VPS. Then we have domain, and finally, pricing. Let's see what we get up to this point. All right, the first thing we need to address is the background color of the navigation bar. We should set it to black, and then we should enable flex so these items are laid out horizontally. So back to our style sheet, let's define a rule for our navs, and let's set the background to black. Then we're going to set display to flex, and by default, flex direction is horizontal, so great. Next, we're going to set justify content to space between. So the first and last items are pushed to the side, and the remaining space is distributed between other items. Why do we need this? Because on mobile, we want these 2 items to be pushed to the edges of the container. Now, for the list of items to appear on the next line, we're going to enable wrapping on our navigation bar and then give the list a width of 100%. Let's see what happens if we don't do this. So save the changes here. Now, back in the browser. So we have all these 3 elements on one line. We want to push this list to the second line. So back to our markup. Here's our list. I'm going to give it an extra class like nav list. We could also reuse the list class, but this would require nesting in our rule. So we would have to write a rule like nav list. That is totally fine. We're not going to have a second class in this nav, but I personally prefer to assign classes to individual elements in a component. So instead of nav list, we're going to use nav list. Good. Now we're going to give this a width of 100% and enable wrapping here. So flex wrap, we set it to wrap. Now take a look. All right, look, the list is on the second line. Now there are a few problems we need to address: the color of these links and the padding before and between these elements. So back to our markup, we're going to give these list items a class like nav item. Now, in our style sheet, we define a rule. I'm going to give these a padding of 0 and 2 rams. And with this, they're not so close to the edge of the container. Great. Now for the color, if we apply the color property here, let's say D2, D0, DB, the color doesn't get changed because links have their own colors. So we need to write a new rule and say nav item. Here we can use the direct child selector to target the anchor inside this element. And then we move this property over here. Now, there's really no need to assign this element an individual class like nav link. We could certainly do that, but it's literally impossible. We're going to replace this anchor with another element. We should always have anchors on a navigation bar, right? Now take a look. Okay, good. Now I want to add a border below each item. So back to our nav item. Here we're going to set border bottom to 1 pixel, solid, 222, which is a really dark gray. Take a look. Okay, that looks good. Now, these items are so close to these borders. So let's apply a vertical padding as well. Let's say 0.5 rems. Now they look better. Next, we need to change the color of these links when we hover over them. So we're going to grab this rule, duplicate it, and then use the hover pseudo class selector. I'm going to change the color to FFF, pure white. And here's what we get. That looks good. Now let's apply a transition to make this look nicer. So back to this rule for our anchor. We're going to set the transition property to color, let's say 0.3 seconds. And with this, the transition is smoother. Great. Now this toggler button is currently so close to the edges of the container. So I want to apply a tiny padding here. So back to our nav, let's set the padding to 1 rem, horizontal and vertical. Here's what we get. That's nicer. Now currently, this icon looks a little bit too white for my taste. So initially, I want to change the opacity and make this a little bit darker. Then when we click on it and our navigation bar is expanded, I want the icon to be pure white. So back to our markup, here's the SVG element. I'm going to give this an extra class called nav _toggler. Now we define a new rule and say this nav toggler should initially have the opacity of 0.5. So it looks darker, great. Now, when the navigation bar is expanded, I want to make this brighter. So we need to add a few classes to our navigation bar to make it a collapsible component. So back to our nav element, to make this a collapsible component, we should give it an extra class that is collapsible. Good. Now, what about this navigation list? What class should we use here? Well, this list should be initially hidden and it should only appear when the user clicks on the toggler button. So this is the collapsible content. It's the content that can be expanded or collapsed, right? So here we're going to add another class, collapsible content. Let's test our implementation. So here's what we get. Don't worry about the extra space. We'll take care of that in a second. Let's just test the navigation bar. So click. Beautiful. Our JavaScript code kicked in and we could see the menu items. Let's click on it again. Good. Also, look at this beautiful animation, this beautiful transition. We implemented this earlier as part of building the collapsible component in isolation. Now, where is this extra space coming from? Well, let's inspect the navigation bar. So here's our nav element. Nothing crazy going on here. We only have a tiny padding inside this element. Now I'm going to expand this element. We have the logo. Now, if you pay close attention, you can see that the space below the logo is almost twice or 3 times the space above the logo. This has to do with how this image was exported. Unfortunately, this is not something I can fix because I don't know anything about vector-based drawing tools. So we just have to deal with it. Next, we have our toggler button. Nothing wrong here. Then we have our list. This orange area represents a margin. So look at the computer tab. We have 24 pixels of margin above and below this list. Very easy to fix. So back to the rule for our navigation list. We're going to set the margin to 0. All right, that's better. We still have some more space here. What I'm going to do is to remove the vertical padding. So we don't need the padding on the top and on the bottom because this image is large enough. So it's going to make our navigation bar tall enough. So we're going to get rid of that extra space. So back to the rule for our nav element. I'm going to change the padding to 0 for vertical and 1 rem for horizontal padding. Now, look, our navigation bar is narrower, it's better, but this button is not in the middle. Very easy to fix. Back to our navigation bar, we're going to use the align items property to align items along the secondary axis, which is in this case, the vertical axis. So we're going to set this to center. And here's what we get. We still have some more space below the logo. Unfortunately, we have to deal with it. So we're almost there. Now, when we click on this toggler, I want to make it brighter and I want to add a shadow around it. How can we implement this? Well, you know that when our navigation bar gets collapsed, here we're going to have an extra class called collapsible expanded. Now, when we're in this state, I want to apply some extra styles to nav toggler. So let's remove this. I'm going to cut this. Back to our style sheet. Let's define a new rule and say if we have this class, the nav toggler here should be brighter. So we set the opacity to 1. Let's test this change and see what happens. So click, it becomes brighter. Great. But there is a tiny problem with this implementation. As you know, this class is something generic. It's got nothing to do with our navigation bars. So on this page, we can have other collapsible content. Now, it's very unlikely that we're going to have an element with this class in another collapsible component. So this implementation is going to work almost all the time. But I want to be more specific here. I want to make sure that this style is only applied to a navigation bar that is expanded. How can we do that? We use a double class selector. So I want to select an element that has both the nav class as well as collapsible expanded. So here we type .nav, and right after that, without a space, we type .collapsible expanded. With this, we can select an element that has both these classes, okay? So we set the opacity to 1. I also want to give this a box shadow. So box shadow, 0 and 0 for horizontal and vertical offset, 0 for blurring and making the shadow softer. I just want to spread it by 3 pixels. And for the color, I'm going to use 666. Not a good number. So let's see what happens. Here's what we get. It looks a little bit ugly because our button has round corners, but the shadow doesn't. So let's apply a border radius of 5 pixels here. Now take a look. Beautiful. Now one tiny problem is that the box shadow appears very suddenly. So we can apply a transition here. So back to the rule for nav toggler. We're going to set the transition to box shadow. Let's say 0.15 seconds. Also, I want to set the cursor to pointer so the toggler looks clickable. Take a look. All right, now we have this beautiful transition. Great. We're done with the mobile version. Now for desktop, we're going to write a media query to hide the toggler. Then for our navigation list, we're going to remove the width of 100%. We're going to set the width to auto so it will stretch enough to fit its content. With this, it will not appear on the second line. It will appear on the first line. So let's write a media query for screens that are wider than, let's say, 768 pixels. So targeting tablets and wider screens. We're going to hide the nav toggler. So we set display to none. Then for our navigation list, we're going to set the width to auto. Now let's see what we get up to this point. So save. Here's what we get. Now we want to use flex here to lay these items horizontally. So back to our navigation list, we're going to set display to flex. Good. Now look, that's better. Now the font is a little bit too big. So we're going to set the font size to 1.6 rems. That's better. Now we should get rid of these borders. So in our media query, we're going to write another rule for nav items and set the border to 0. Good. So that looks pretty decent to me. Let's test it one last time. We're going to go to mobile. Great. Now we can expand or collapse this. There is just one tiny problem here. Let's refresh the page. Initially, the list is invisible. The reason you didn't see this earlier is because our navigation bar was in the expanded state. So back to our media query, this navigation list should always be visible. So earlier when we implemented the collapsible component, to make the collapsible content visible, we set 2 properties. Max height, we're going to set this to 100% of the height of its container, and opacity to 1. With these properties, we can show the navigation list. So take a look. All right. Here's the desktop version and here's the mobile version. Beautiful. To fix the problem with extra space below the logo, we can move the logo a few pixels down. It's kind of like a hack, but I think it's going to work. So back to our markup. Here's our logo. I'm going to give the anchor a class like nav _brand. Now back to our style sheet. Outside of our media query, we're going to write a new rule for nav brand. Here we can set transform to translate Y and push this, let's say, 3 pixels down. It's not enough. What about 5 pixels? I think that's right in the middle. Perfect. All right, we're done with this component. I know this was a very long lesson. The good news is that this was probably the hardest component to build in this course. So going forward, everything is going to be much easier. We have already built all the building blocks of this page. All we're going to do is just put them together to build our home page. So I want to say thank you for your patience and your attention. In the next lesson, we're going to build the hero component. All right, now we're going to build this hero component, also called a banner. So here we have a block that is dark and is skewed to the left. In this block, we have a 2-column grid. In the first column, we have some content, and in the second column, we have an image. So here's the desktop version. On mobile, we have a 1-column grid. Now we have all the essential components to build this bigger component. So back to our project. First, we're going to grab this image, banner.png, and add it to our project. Good. Now, let's go to index.html. We can represent this component using the section element. So we're going to add a section with a few classes: block, block dark, and block skewed left. Good. Now, inside the section, we're going to have a grid. So we had a div with 2 classes, grid and grid 1x2. Good. Now, if you look at the desktop version of our design, you can see that the content of this component is constrained by container, a container that is 1140 pixels wide. So one way to implement this is to add a div with the class of container, and then we move the grid inside this container. That's one way. Another way is to apply the container class right here. So we're going to have a container, which also happens to be a 2-column grid. So I'm going to get rid of this unnecessary element. Good. So we have our container. Now our elements. So in our first column, we're going to have an H1 element followed by a paragraph and a button. We should wrap all these elements inside a container, so that container is going to be the first item in our grid. So let's add a div with the class of hero content. Now in this container, we're going to have an H1. The label is cloud hosting for pros. Next, we have a paragraph that says deploy your websites in less than 60 seconds. Good. And then we have a button. Well, technically, we have an anchor because when the user clicks on the button, they should be navigated perhaps to the sign up page. So I'm going to add an anchor with 2 classes, btn and btn accent. Actually, we need one more class because as you can see, this button is a little bit stretched. So the third class is btn stretched. Good. And the label is get started. So that is our first grid item that is going to go in the first column. Now, the image for the second column. We add an image and set the source to images/banner.png. Now, I'm not going to set the alt attribute because this image is purely for decoration. So let's see what we get up to this point. All right, first of all, our heading has this bluish kind of color. And second, there's so much space between these lines. Let's see where is this coming from. So we inspect this element. Here in the computer tab, we look at the line height property. So look, this is coming from the style that we defined at the beginning of the course. So earlier, we set the line height for the body element to 1.5. This is great for body text, but it doesn't look good for our headings. We want our headings to be compact. So back to our style sheet, in the topography section, we have this rule for our headings. In the same rule, I'm going to set the line height to 1.1. Now, that looks better. Next, we should fix the color. So earlier we defined this rule and said, if we have a dark block, the headings should be white. So back to our markup. Here's our heading. We should give it a class called block heading. Good. That looks better. Next, we need to work on this text. Here's our paragraph. I'm going to give it a class called hero _tagline. Now, back to our style sheet. In the hero section, we're going to define a rule for our tagline. Here, I'm going to set the font size to 2 rams and the color to B9 C3 CF. Now, let's see what we get. So that looks better. Now, back to our design mockup, look at the space between these letters. Here we have some more space. So back to our style sheet, we're going to set letter spacing to 1 pixel. Good. So that is closer to our design mockup. Now currently the text is so close to the heading and the button. So we're going to give it a top margin of 2 rems and a bottom margin of 5 rems. Okay, that is better. I just want to highlight something here. In this implementation, I've defined these properties as part of an element called tagline, which belongs to the hero component. Now, as we learn more about this website, as we build more pages, if you find out that there are other paragraphs that need the exact same style, then we should extract these styles and put them in a separate reusable class. So we want to apply object-oriented principles. We want to separate content from container, okay? Now back to the browser. On this page, we have horizontal scrolling. Look, terrible. Why is this happening? This has to do with our image. Our image is way too large, but here we want to have a responsive image that stretches to fill its container. So back to our markup, here's the image for the banner. We're going to give this a class called hero image. And then back in our style sheet, we define a new rule called hero image. Here we're going to set the width to 100%. So this solves the problem. And as we resize the browser window, the image also stretches. Great. Now let's look at the mobile version of our design. So we have a 1-column grid. Now the next thing we need to work on is the alignment of the heading and the text. Currently, these items are left aligned, but on mobile, they should be center aligned. How can we fix this? Well, earlier when we implemented the block component, we assumed that our blocks can have a header and the header should be center aligned. So we can assume that this content that we have here is the header of our block component. So back to our markup, this is the div with the class of hero content. We're going to make this the header of our block component. So first, I'm going to change the element type from div to header. And one more time here. Then I'm going to give this a second class, which is block header. Also, note the order of these classes. So first we add more generic classes, and then we use specialized classes to overwrite the styles defined in generic classes, okay? So now we have a block header, and with this, our content becomes center aligned. Beautiful. So I believe the mobile version looks great. The only problem we have is the angle of this block. Compare this with our design mockup. Our implementation looks more steep. So earlier we defined this polygon for clipping the blocks that are skewed to the left. These numbers don't work for our hero component. Now, one way is to change this number here to 90%. This solves the problem. Now look, here's our browser version and here's the design mockup. They look pretty similar. But what if we have other blocks that need a different polygon? So the original 80%. Well, we're going to overwrite this property in our hero component. So I'm going to copy this property. Now, in the hero section, we define a new rule and say our hero should have a different clip path, a different polygon. Now, I just told you that when listing these classes, we should start with more generic classes and then list specialized classes to overwrite styles. So this section is a block. These are the generic classes. Then we're going to add a specialized class like hero, and this will overwrite the clip path property. So take a look. Great, that solved the problem. So we're done with the mobile version. Now let's customize this for wider screens. So on tablets or wider screens, we want to left align the content. So we're going to write a new media query for screens that are wider than 768 pixels. Here we define a rule for hero content and set text align to left. Okay, good. Now I'm going to make the browser wider and see what happens. So here's what we get. Look, the text or the content is not properly aligned with the image. On wide screens, the content area should be vertically in the middle. So back to our media query, our content element is inside a grid. We want to change the vertical alignment of this item. What property are we going to use? Align self. We're going to set this to center. Now take a look. Okay, the content is right in the middle. Beautiful. So I believe we are pretty much done with this element. There is just one tiny problem. Currently, there is so much space on the top. So we should remove the top padding on white screens. So back to our media query, we're going to define a new rule for our hero and set padding top to 0. Now, why didn't we apply this across the board for all devices? Well, on mobile, we want to have some top padding. We don't want to remove it. But on white screens, because this image is fairly tall, it's going to naturally add some extra padding here. So we don't need to apply a top padding to the entire hero component, okay? So let's save the changes and see what we get. All right, here's the desktop version. Now let's look at tablet, looks great. And then finally, mobile. So we're done with this component. Next, we're going to talk about optimizing this image. All right, let's talk about optimizing images. So in this images folder, look at the size of this file, banner.png. It's 916 kilobytes. It's almost 1 megabyte. That's a really large image to serve on our internet. So far, we have only added a single image, but what if we add multiple images? All these images together are going to make our web page really heavy. So if the user is on a slow connection, they're going to have a really bad experience. So let's talk about a few strategies for optimizing this image. First, I'm going to open this with Photoshop. Okay, now let's look at the dimensions of this image. So on the top, we go to image and then image size. Look at the width of this image. It's over 1500 pixels. Take a note of this number somewhere. Now, back to our design mockup. On desktop, this image is taking up half of the width of the hero component. And we know that our hero component and other components are constrained by a container that is 1140 pixels wide. So let's pull up our calculator and do a simple calculation. If the width of the page is 1140 pixels and the image takes up only half of that, on desktop, our image is not going to stretch beyond 570 pixels. Okay. Now, what about mobile? On mobile, this image is going to stretch and take up the entire width of the page. But we know that the resolution of mobile devices is under 500 pixels. So in reality, this image is never going to be wider than 570 pixels. So back to our image, let's pull up the image size dialog box one more time. So essentially, we're serving a 1500 pixel wide image just to have it resized by the browser to 500 pixels wide. With this, all these extra bytes that have to be transmitted over the network will be wasted. And also, the browser has to take care of the resizing operation, which is something we don't want browsers to do, because the browser has to load a large image just to cut it by a third. In an ideal world, the image we serve should be exactly the same size it should be displayed. But we don't live in an ideal world, so this is almost impossible because there are so many screens with varying sizes, so it's impossible to serve an image that would cater for all these screens. So what can we do here? Well, assuming that our image is not going to be wider than 570 pixels, we can serve the image in this size, and if there are any small variations, we let the browser take care of resizing the image. Resizing from 570 pixels to, let's say, 500 pixels is not a big deal. It's something we can live with. Now, there is one more thing we need to take into account here before we resize the image, and that is the pixel density of the screen. We talked about this in the second part of this series. So modern screens have higher pixel densities like 1.5, 2, 3, and so on. Apple called these screens retina displays. So to make our image look really sharp on these modern screens, we have to provide 2x or 3x versions of this image. So if our base size is 570 pixels, the 2x version is going to be 1140 pixels. What about the 3x version? Well, 570 times 3. That is 1700 pixels. Now, our original image is only 1500 pixels wide, so enlarging it doesn't really make sense because Photoshop has to use some math to build new pixels. These pixels were not in the original design. So we're only going to support 1x and 2x screens. So first, I'm going to resize this to 1140 and then save it as a new file. So here in the images folder, I'm going to create a new folder called resized. Now we're going to call this file banner at 2x because that's the 2x version. And then in this dialog box, we're going to select smallest file size. Good. So we're done with the 2x version. Now, let's resize this one more time. We're going to set the width to 570. And then save the file as banner.png. Okay, good. Now we have two new PNG files. The 1x version is only 248 kilobytes, so that's a great saving from 900 kilobytes. Now for retina displays, we're going to serve the 2x version, which is 700 kilobytes. So we still have some saving that's about 200 kilobytes. But we're not done yet. We can make these images smaller by using a modern format like WebP. We talked about this in the second part of the series. So head over to cloudconvert.com. On this image, we're going to select our new PNG files. Good. Now, from this drop-down box, we're going to select WebP. Okay. Let's go ahead and do the conversion. All right, the conversion is done. So here's the 2x version in WebP. Let's download this. And we also have the regular version or the 1x version. Let's download this as well. Good. All right, here's the end result. For the 1x version, the PNG file is 248 kilobytes, but the WebP file is only 40 kilobytes. That's a huge saving. Now look at the 2x version. The PNG is just over 700 kilobytes, but the WebP version is just over 100 kilobytes. Any of these files served on our internet is far better than 900 kilobytes, the original image. So we're going to add these files to our project. Back to VS Code, let's select all these files and drop them onto the images folder. Now we're going to replace the original banner.png. Let's go with that. Good. Now, let's pull up index.html. So this is where we're using the hero image. We need to make a small change here. We have to wrap this image inside a picture element. So let's pull up the command palette and wrap this with the picture element. Good. Now, a picture can have multiple sources. So here's the first source. We're going to set the type to image/webp and source set to two sources, the 1x version and the 2x version in WebP. So images/banner.webp for 1x displays and images/banner@2x.webp for 2x displays. Good. So that was the first source. Now let's duplicate this element and change the type to PNG. And of course, we should change the file extension as well. So I've selected this WebP. Now I'm going to press Command and D on Mac, or you can press Control and D on Windows to enable multi-cursor editing. So we're going to change both these extensions to PNG. Good. So we have two sources. We should always have an image element. Otherwise, the image is not shown. This is where we apply classes or set the alt attribute. Okay. Now let's see what we get. So back to the browser. Let's pull up Chrome DevTools, go to the Network tab, and then refresh the page. So look, on my machine, I'm getting this file, banner@2x.webp, because Chrome supports the WebP format. In fact, most of the browsers out there do support the WebP format. Now, because I'm on a Mac, I have a Retina display, so I'm getting the 2x version, which is only 100 kilobytes. So originally we had a 900 kilobyte image, but now we're serving a 100 kilobyte image. Now let me show you something really cool. Let's open this page in Firefox and pull up Firefox DevTools. So on the top, we go to Tools, Web Developer, Toggle Tools. Now look at the shortcut. On Mac, it's Alt, Command, and I. This is the same shortcut we have in Chrome, okay? So here's Firefox DevTools. Now if we click on this icon, we can go to the responsive mode. Now on this page, we can select various devices like iPad, iPhone, and so on. Chrome has this as well. But let me show you something really cool. Over here, we have a drop-down list to select device pixel ratio. So we can see 1x, 2x, and 3x versions. Now, to see things more clearly, I'm going to zoom in by pressing Command and plus. If you're on Windows, you probably have to press Control and plus. So let's zoom in. So here's the 1x version. Now look at this image. Do you see that the edges are a little bit blurry? Because we are serving the 1x version. Now let's see the difference if we serve the 2x version of this image. So 2x. Now look, the edges are really sharp. So the whole point of serving 2x or 3x images is to make our images look sharp on Retina displays. So we're done with the implementation of the hero component. Now it's time to store this template as a separate file in the components folder. So whether we build really small components like buttons and links, or larger, more complex components like a hero component, we're going to store their template inside the components folder. Later, when we want to build the home page, all we have to do is to combine these components into a single page. As simple as that. So let's grab this entire section. Then in the components folder, we're going to add a new file called hero.html, paste it here, and we're done. All right, the next block we're going to build is this part of the page, which I call the domain block. So here we have a heading, some text, a search box, and the domain prices. We're not going to include the cards because these cards represent our plans. Plans and domain lookup are two completely different concepts, okay? So here's the standard version. On mobile, we're going to display these items or these domain prices like this. So back to our markup, we're going to start with a new section and give it two classes. The first one is block. The second one is container. So all of our content is constrained by 1140 pixels, okay? Now inside this section, we're going to have a header with a class of block _, header. With this class, we can center align the heading and the paragraph. So in the header, we're going to have an H2 element, and here we can say starting at $9 per month. Then we're going to have a paragraph with 10 words. Good. Here's what we get. That looks pretty good, but we can customize it further if needed. Okay. Then we need to add an input group. So we pull up the template for our input groups and copy this entire code. Then paste it after the header. Let's see what we get. So that looks pretty good to me. One thing that is missing is the search icon. So let's pull up the template for the icon component. Now, in this case, we only want to grab the SVG. We don't want to put the icon on a circle with a background color. So let's copy this SVG and we're going to go to our button. We're going to paste that icon right before the label. Okay. Next, we should change the icon from WordPress to search and the class from icon primary to icon white. Let's see what we get. All right. The icon is way too big, but I got a question for you. Where is the right place to size this icon? Pause the video and think about it for a few seconds. It is possible that we're going to have many other buttons with icons. So we should define the size of an icon inside a button in the button section. So we want to make this something reusable. So here's the rule for the button class. Then we're going to define a new rule and say in the button, if you have an icon, the width of the icon should be, let's say 2 rams. The height should also be 2 rams. And we should give it a margin right of 1 ram. So the icon is separated from the label. Take a look. Okay, that's better. Now look at the position of this magnifying glass. Compare this with our design mockup. Do you see the difference? The magnifying glass is right in the middle of this line. But in our implementation, the magnifying glass and the label are bottom aligned. To solve this issue, we need to set vertical align to middle. Now take a look. Okay, that's perfect. Now, there are a couple of problems with the input box. The first problem is that our padding is a little bit off. It would be nicer if we had more horizontal padding. So let's see where this is coming from. Let's inspect this element. Here's our input group. Inside this input group, we have an input component. Now look at the padding we applied here. We're using 1.5 rams for vertical and 1 ram for horizontal. I don't know why I use 1 ram, it's not enough. So I'm going to change this to 2 ram. But where is this defined? On the line 290 of our style sheet. Back to VS Code. On the top, we go to the Go menu. Now look at the shortcut for Go to line. On Mac, it's Control and G. So let's quickly jump to line 290. Good. And then we're going to change the padding to 2 rams. Good. All right, that's better. Now, the next thing we should address is the shadow around this input group. Earlier, I told you that I didn't want to add the shadow to every input group because that would make our page really messy. So here we have 2 solutions. One solution is to apply the shadow to the instance of the input group in this block. The other solution is to define a utility class for adding shadows to different elements. With that solution, we can use that class in our markup like this. So here's our input group. Then we can add a class like box shadow. Now, the problem with that approach is that the more we use these utility classes, the more our markup starts to talk about styling. So we'll move away from semantic markup. Now, there are frameworks like Tailwind, which are based on this concept. These are called utility first or atomic CSS frameworks. In these frameworks, there are tons of utility classes like box shadow, border, font, text align, and so on. Some people love those frameworks, others hate them. In this course, we're not going to take that approach, so I'm not going to define a utility class here. Instead, I'm going to style this instance of the input group inside the block we're building. So let's give this block a specific class like block domain. Now, back to our style sheet, we define a new section called domain block. And here we define a new rule and say, in this block, the input group should have a box shadow of 0 and 0 for the offset, 30 pixels for blurring, 20 pixels for radius, and for the color, we're going to use E6, EB, EE. Okay. So here's the shadow, but we should remove the border. So let's set the border to 0. Okay, that's much closer to our design mockup, but we need more space between the input group and the text. Compare this with our design mockup. We have slightly more space here. So let's give this a margin of 4 rems for vertical and 0 for horizontal. Okay, that's better. Now, if we click on this button, we get this ugly blue that Chrome adds. This is called the outline. To get rid of it, we have to go to the rule for our buttons. And here we're going to set the outline to 0. Now, note that all these properties are sorted. That's why I added this property over here. Okay. Now, let's test it one more time. Good. So the outline is gone. Next, we need to add the domain prices. Now, earlier we defined a list component which can be inline, but I made a mistake there because these items are not exactly inline. If you pay close attention, you can see that they're lined up perfectly in rows and columns. If we use an inline list, depending on the width of the viewport, these items may not be lined up properly. So what layout should we use to implement this? We should use a grid. So back to our markup, after the div that represents our input group, we're going to add the list of prices. So here we add a UL and give it the class of list. So we remove the bullet points and the left padding. Okay. Now we should use the grid layout here. So I'm going to give this an extra class like domain prices. And this is an element of the domain block. So it would be better to call this block domain __ prices. So this is an element inside this block or this component. Okay. Now let's grab this and back to our style sheet. We're going to define a new rule and say this element uses a grid. So display grid. Now on mobile, we're going to have 3 columns and 2 rows. So here we need to set grid template columns to repeat 3 and 1 FR. So we're going to divide the free space into 3 fractions or 3 slices and give each column 1 slice. Okay. Then we're going to set grid template rows to repeat to 6 rem. This is for setting the height of each row. If we don't set this, our items are going to be so close. Now that we have defined a grid, let's go back to our markup and add the domain prices. So we're going to have 6 list items. So li times 6. The first one is going to be .com for $9. The second one is going to be .sg for $10. Now I'm going to pause the recording and fill up the rest. All right, our list is ready. Let's see what we get. So here's what we get. Our items are perfectly aligned. Now we need to reduce the font size and use a badge in one of these elements. So I'm going to use a badge for the first element. I'm going to wrap this with a span with a class of badge and badge double hyphens secondary. So now we have a badge here. Perfect. Next, we need to set the font size. So back to this rule, I'm going to set the font size to 2 rems and font weight to 600. Take a look. Okay. That's pretty close to our design mockup. Now, in this design mockup, you can see that these items are horizontally aligned in the center. But in our implementation, these items are left aligned. So which property should we use to set the alignment? Justify items. That is for the horizontal alignment, right? We set this to center. Good. So that is very close to our design mockup. I think the mobile version looks pretty good. Now, let's look at tablets and wider screens. So on tablets, we have so much space between these elements. So we want to lay these out horizontally in one line. So we're going to define a media query for screens that are wider than 768 pixels. In this block, we're going to define a rule for block domain prices. Now, this is the interesting part. We're going to change the template for our columns. One way to solve this problem is to use repeat 6 1FR. So we're going to divide the space into 6 fractions and give each item 1 fraction. Take a look. That looks pretty good. But what if tomorrow we decide to add one more item here or remove one of these items? Then we'll have to remember to come back here and change this number. So let me show you a cool trick. Instead of hard coding this value like 6, we can use a predefined value called auto fit. With this, the grid will try to create as many columns as needed to fit all these items. Now, if we use a fraction unit here, this is not going to work. So look, we still have 3 columns. Now, what if we change this to an absolute value like 100 pixels? Now, take a look. Let me expand this element so we see what is going on here. So here's our list. Now, if we click on this grid badge, we'll see the grid overlay. Look at the columns. We have 6 columns, and each column is 100 pixels wide. So the grid calculated the number of columns properly, but we don't want to force the width of 100 pixels to our columns. So what can we do here? Well, here we can use the min-max function to provide a range. So this function takes 2 values or 2 arguments, a minimum and a maximum. We can say our columns should be a minimum of 100 pixels and a maximum of 1 fraction. So if there's extra space available, like what we have over here, that extra space will be equally distributed to these columns. Now, let me save the changes. Take a look. So we have 6 columns, and all these columns are beautifully sized. Now back to our markup. If tomorrow we decide to add another item in this list, the number and the size of columns are going to get calculated properly again. So let's remove this new item. Now back to our style sheet. So here we're using 100 pixels. We can replace this with 10 rems, which is 100 pixels as well. So we get the same result as before. Now back to our design mockup for standard screens. Look at the width of this list. This list is not taking up all the available space in the container. So here are the boundaries of our container. Our list is kind of smaller and in the middle. The same is true for this input group. So let's grab our ruler and do a quick measurement. What is the width of this list? It is just over 700 pixels. So back to the rule for domain prices. Here we're going to add another property and set max width to, let's say, 700 pixels. All right, here's what we get. So our list is not going to grow beyond 700 pixels, but we don't want this to be in the left. We want it to be in the center. How can we solve this? By setting the horizontal margin to auto. So all the available space will be equally spread to the left and right margins. So I'm going to set the margin to 0 for vertical and auto for horizontal. Now take a look. Perfect. We need to apply the same technique on this input group. So here's the rule for our input group. Earlier we set the margin to 4 rems vertical and 0 horizontal. I'm going to change this to auto and then set a max width of 670 pixels. All right, that's much better. So let's test this component one last time. Here's the mobile version where we have all these items distributed in these columns. Beautiful. Then we have the tablet version and the desktop version. Perfect. So we're done with this component. Let's move on to the next lesson. All right, now we're going to build the plans block. This one is pretty easy, and I want you to do it as an exercise. Now, before you get started, let me give you a couple of hints. On desktop, the popular plan should be slightly larger than other plans. And also, when we hover over any of these plans, I want the plan to get slightly larger with a nice transition. With all that, spend 5 to 10 minutes on this, then come back see my solution. So back to our markup, we're going to start a new section with two classes, block and container. Now inside this section, we're going to have a grid. So a grid, well, a 3-column grid. So here's the second class, good. Now we need to grab the template for our plans. So let's pull up plans.html, copy this entire code and paste it right here. So here's our plan markup. I'm going to remove this class because the first plan is not the popular one. Good. Now we need to add another plan. So down the end, look, we have so many divs. We don't know which div is representing what. So we can click on this div. Now on the top over here, we can see the opening div. So this is the div that represents a plan. Now right after this, we can paste another plan. This is the popular one. So we're going to keep this class, but I'm going to change the skin for this card from secondary to primary so we get that medium blue. We should also change the skin for this badge to primary. Good. Now one last plan. So here's the end of the popular plan. Great. Now we're going to paste another plan and we should remove this class as well. Good. Let's see what we have up to this point. So here's the mobile version. It looks great already. The only problem I see is that these cards or these plans are so close to each other. We can solve this problem by applying a gap to our grid. So back to our markup. I want to quickly jump back to our section without scrolling up and down. So look, here's our section. Let's click on this. Then we select it here. And our cursor is right at the section element. So I'm going to give this an extra class called block-plans. Now back to our style sheet. We define a new section called plans block. And then add a rule and say, in the block that is called plans, our grid should have a gap of 4 rems. Now, in case you're wondering why I'm naming these classes in the reverse order. So over here, we are saying plans block, but the name of the class is block plans. Why is that? Well, with this convention, we can see all kinds of blocks. So here we have block plans. Later on, we're going to create another block called features and so on. Okay. So we applied a gap. Now let's take a look. So we have some space here. That looks great. Now on mobile, we don't want to make this card larger because it's going to pop out of the screen. Doesn't make sense. So I believe the mobile version is done. Now let's look at the tablet version. So look, that doesn't look good. We don't want a card that is so wide. So on tablets, we want to make the card a little bit smaller and then put it right in the center. Now there are 2 ways to solve this problem. We can write a media query for this card and set the width property, but there is another solution. Back to our style sheet, we can define a new rule and say, in this block, our cards should have a max width of, let's say 500 pixels. Now take a look. That is better. With this, we don't have to write a media query. So our cards are never going to stretch beyond 500 pixels. If the screen is wider, nothing is going to happen. Well, we get the 3-column layout, which we're going to talk about in a second. But if you go to mobile, the size changes dynamically, but no more than 500 pixels. Great. Now, to put this in the center, once again, we're going to assign auto to horizontal margin. So back to this rule. Here we set margin to 0 auto. Take a look. Good. That looks great. Now there's one issue here. Look at this badge. It's lost because we're using the same background color for the badge and the card. So where should we fix this? Where is the right place to do this? Well, early in the course, we added this rule in the card section. So here we are saying in secondary cards, if you have a secondary badge, its background should be slightly different. With this, anywhere we put a secondary badge inside a secondary card, our badge is going to have the right color. So we don't have to repeat this style all over the place. So we're going to take the same approach. Here in the card section, I'm going to define another rule and say, if you have a primary card, and in this card we have a primary badge, the background should be 126 DE4. Now take a look. So the problem is gone. Beautiful. So the tablet version also looks great. Now what about desktop, laptop or desktop? So the layout works fine. We just need to make the popular plan slightly larger. So back to our style sheet, in the section for styling our plan components, earlier we defined a rule for popular plans. Now we're going to define a new rule and say, if you have a plan that is popular, it should be slightly larger. So here we can use the transform property and scale this to 1.1, so 10% larger. So I'm applying this rule here generally to all popular plans, whether they are in the plans block or not. So once again, this is object-oriented CSS in action. We want to separate content from container. So we don't want to make this larger only in this block, because if you have this plan or another plan that is popular in another block, then we'll have to make that plan larger as well. So let's see if this works. Back to the browser. Our popular plan is larger, great. The last thing we need to implement is the hover effect. So once again, in the plans section, down the bottom, before our media query, I'm going to write our hover stats. So if you hover over a plan, once again, I want to scale it to 1.05, so 5% larger. Now look, okay, this is working. Now if you hover over a popular plan, it becomes smaller, because initially we scaled this by 10%, but when we hover over it, we scale it by 5%. So we need a second rule for the hover effect on popular plans. So I'm going to grab this rule and duplicate it, and then change the class to plan popular. And here we're going to use a larger value, so 1.15. Now take a look. So that works perfectly fine, but the transition is so sudden, so let's smooth it using the transition property. So back to the plan section, I'm going to define a new rule for all plans, whether they're popular or not. And here I'm going to set the transition property to transform 0.2 seconds ease out. So I'm applying this transition across the board to all plans, whether they're popular or not. Let's save the changes and see what we get. Now we have this beautiful transition. I love it. Let's just make sure that this works on a small screen as well. So I'm going to make the browser smaller. Now you might argue that on a mobile device, we're not going to see the hover effect. That's absolutely right. But what if the user is using a desktop computer, but the browser is small? We should count for those scenarios as well. So take a look. See, when we hover over the plan, it becomes too close to the next card. Look over here. Oh, we don't want weird issues like that on our website. So how can we solve this problem? Well, we want to increase the gap between these rows. So back to the plans block, we applied a gap of 4 rem to columns and rows. Obviously, this is not going to work. So for rows, I'm going to use 8 rems of gap. And for columns, which appear on a white screen, we're going to have 4 rems of gap. Now take a look. So on a mobile screen, we have 8 rems of gap between these rows, and nothing happens when we hover over this card. Great. Now on desktop, we're going to have 4 rems of gap between these columns. Great. So we're done with this component. Just like always, now it's time to store its template somewhere in a separate file. All right, here's the next section we're going to build. Now in this section, we have this repetitive pattern. We have a 2-column grid with some content on one side and an image on the other side. Here's another instance of this pattern. So to build this section, first we're going to build this pattern or this component. Then we're going to combine all these components together and add the heading and some paragraph on the top to build the entire block or the entire section. So in this lesson, we just want to focus on this part. I'm going to call this a feature component. Now, once again, I believe you have all the necessary skills to build this component on your own. So spend 10 minutes on this and then come back see my solution. So we're going to build a feature component. Now, what HTML element should we use to represent each feature? We can certainly use a div, but a more semantic choice is the article element. So we talked about this in the first part of this series. I told you that with the article element, we can represent any independent, self-contained piece of content. So back to our design mockup, each of these features is an independent, self-contained piece of content, right? So we have an article. Now, this article is essentially a 2-column grid. So here we're going to add 2 classes, grid and grid 1x2. Now, in the first column, we're going to have a few items, an icon, a heading, a paragraph, and a link. We should wrap all of these elements inside a container. So that container is going to be the first item in our grid. So we're going to add a div. Now, inside this div, we need an icon. So let's bring up the template for our icons. I'm going to copy all of this code and then paste it right here. Now, below the icon, we need a heading. What kind of heading element do we use here? Well, back to our design. Here we have an H2 element. So the next heading we should use is H3. So we add an H3 and say super easy to use. Then we add a paragraph with some text, followed by a link. So earlier we built a link component that gives us this kind of look. So we're going to add an anchor with a class of link dash arrow. For the href attribute, I'm just going to use a pound. And here we're going to say learn more. Let's see what we get up to this point. Here's the mobile version. Now there's so much space between the icon and the heading. And this comes from the top margin of the heading. But I don't want to remove the top margin from all H3 elements because somewhere else we might have multiple paragraphs separated by H3 elements. So we want to have the top margin to separate this section from previous sections, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to give this a class like feature _heading. And in the future, we can always change the type of this element from H3 to something else, okay? Now, let's define a new section called features. Here we're going to add a rule for our headings and set the margin to 1 rem vertical and 0 horizontal. So here's what we get. That looks pretty good. Now, what about the padding around the content? The content is currently so close to the edges of the screen. Well, we can apply some padding to the feature component, but in this case, I don't want to apply a padding because eventually we're going to put this inside a block and the block will apply some horizontal padding. So for now, I don't want to worry about this, okay? So here in the mobile version, we have built this part and this looks very similar to what we have built here. Great. Now we need to add an image. So back to our markup, after the div that wraps all the content of this feature, we're going to add an image. Now back to the images folder, look at this file, easy.jpg. The size of this file is over 200 kilobytes. We can optimize this file using the same strategy we talked about earlier. So on laptops and desktops, this image is going to take up half of our container, so it's going to be a maximum of 570 pixels. Now on mobiles, the image is going to stretch to take up all the available space. Now once again, the width of most, if not all mobile devices is under 500 pixels. So again, we're going to pick 570 as the base size for this image. Then we're going to supply an additional version for 2x screens. Now, because these steps are repetitive, I'm going to pause the recording. I'm going to resize the image in Photoshop and then convert it to WebP using cloudconvert.com. So here's the end result. For standard density screens, we have a JPEG, which is 33 kilobytes, and a WebP, which is 14 kilobytes, far better than 200 kilobytes. For high density screens, we have a JPEG that is 57 kilobytes and a WebP that is 28 kilobytes. So let's add all of these files to our project. Good. Now back to our markup. We're going to wrap this image with a picture element. So we wrap it with a picture. Good. Now we add the sources. So here's the first source. We set the type to image/webp and source set to images/easy.webp for 1x screens and images/easy at 2x.webp for 2x screens. Good. Now let's duplicate this element and change the image type to JPG. I'm also going to change the file extensions in one go. So JPG. Good. Now, as I told you before, we should always add the image element. And here we're going to use the high quality JPEG. So that is images/easy at 2x.jpg. So if the browser doesn't support the WebP format, we're going to give it a high quality JPEG. Back to the browser. So here's our image. It's currently so close to our content div, so we need to apply a gap. Back to our markup. Here's our article. We're going to give it an extra class called feature. So once again, look, I'm organizing these classes in a logical manner. So first we start with more generic classes, then we add more specific classes. This way, our code has a nice organization. Now, back to our style sheet, we define a new rule for our features and give them a gap of 4 rems. Good. Take a look. I think that looks better. Now, what about the tablet and desktop version? So I think everything looks great. On tablets and desktops, I think 4 rems of gap is too much. So back to this rule, we're going to use 4 rems of gap for rows and 2 rems for columns. That's better. Now let's pull up Chrome DevTools. Here on the network tab, let's make sure we're getting the right image. So I'm getting easy at 2x.webp. This verifies that our implementation of the picture element is correct. Now back to the browser. Let's make the browser smaller. So for mobile, I believe I forgot something. Look, our image is not responsive. So it's not responding to the changes in the size of the viewport. So back to our markup, here's the picture element and our image is right here. We're going to give it a class and call this feature _image. Then we define a rule and say all the images that we have here should have a width of 100%. Now the image is responsive. Great. Perfect. So we have built the feature component. Now we need to add a few features and wrap them inside a block. The first thing I want to do is to change this icon. That is for WordPress. We have to change this to easy. So back to our markup. This is where we're using the icon. I'm going to change this to easy. Let's make sure it works. Great. So now we need to add a section and give it 2 classes, block and container. Then we're going to move this article inside the section element. So let's grab it and move it right here. Good. Then I'm going to duplicate this a few times and change the labels and icons so they match what we have in our design mockup. Because this is going to be repetitive, I'm going to pause the recording. All right, our section is almost ready. So we have all these features, but there are a couple of problems here. The first problem is the vertical margin between these features. So back to our style sheet, we're going to give each feature a vertical margin of, let's say, 12 rems. So that solves the problem. Great. Now the second problem is the order of these items. Look at our design mockup. The order of the content and the image are changing in alternating rows. How can we implement this? Very easy. Back to our feature. This is the div that wraps our content. I'm going to give this a class, let's say feature _content. Now I'm going to apply the same class to other features. So I'm going to pause the recording and come back in a second. Back to our style sheet. Here we're going to write a media query for screens that are wider than 768 pixels. Here we're going to define a rule and target every second feature. How can we do that? Using pseudo class selectors. So we're going to grab features and then select those with nth of type even. So with this, we're going to select the second, the fourth, the sixth feature, and so on. Then we're going to target feature content. And here we're going to swap the order and set it to 2. So by default, the order of the content is 1 because in our markup, we have added the content first and then the image. So now by setting the order of the content to 2, the image will take up the position of the first item in the grid. So this is a simple way to solve this problem. Another way is to manually change the order of the content and the image in alternating rows. I don't favor that approach because we might make a mistake. So back to the browser. Now take a look. That's exactly like our design mockup. Beautiful. So the last thing we want to add to this section is the heading and the paragraph on the top. So back to the section element. First, we're going to add a header and give it the class of block _header. Here we're going to have an h2 and say host on the cloud to keep growing. And then we add a paragraph with 10 words. Good. That is the final result. It looks very nice and polished. The only problem I see is the space between the first item and the paragraph. look at our design mockup. The space here is less. So back to our style sheet. Once again, we can use pseudo class selectors to target the first feature. So we want to grab the first feature. So we say first of type and overwrite the top margin. So margin top, we're going to set it to 6 rems. That is half the margin we assigned over here. Now take a look. All right, that's much better. So we're done with this section. Let's move on to the next lesson. Okie dokie. The next block we're going to build is the testimonials block, which is pretty straightforward because now we have all the components we need to build this block. So back to our markup, we're going to add a section with the class of block. In this section, we're going to add a header with the class of block header. Now in the header, we're going to have an h2 element and say what our customers are saying. And below that, we're going to have a paragraph with some text. Now, after the header, we're going to add a div with a class of container to constrain our content. Now here, we're going to add a testimonial card. We already built this component before. So let's pull up the template for testimonials, grab all this code, and then paste it inside the container. Good. Now let's take a look. So here's what we get. That looks pretty good. What about the mobile version? That looks really good. We don't really have to do anything extra here. The only problem I see is the space between the card and the text. So where is the right place to apply this? Well, I think the right place to add the margin is in the block header class because we don't want to repeat this margin. We don't want to keep adding this margin in other blocks. So back to the block section. Here's the block header where we set the text align to center. Here we can set the margin bottom to 4 rems. Now take a look. That looks pretty good. Here's the tablet version and the desktop version. All right, the next block we're going to build is the footer. Now this footer has a couple of challenging parts. On mobile, we have these collapsibles, but on desktop, we don't have collapsibles. So these collapsibles are always expanded. So what you need to do is to write a media query and hide the chevron and show the content area. That's one tricky part. The other tricky part is the placement of the logo. On desktop, it's placed in the first column, but on mobile, it's placed in the last row. So I want you to spend 20 minutes on implementing this, then come back see my solution. And by the way, for the footer, don't worry about this callout section. We'll add that later. So we just want to build the footer block. All right, we're going to add a footer element and give it a couple of classes like block and block dark. Now, as you know, block dark is going to give this a pure black background, but the footer that we have in our design mockup doesn't have a pure black background. The background is slightly lighter. So back to our markup, we're going to give this an additional class like footer. Now you might be wondering why I added this class if you're going to set the background in the footer class. Well, earlier we defined some styles for text on a dark block. So we set the color of the headings to white. I don't want to repeat those styles here. That's why I added this class, okay? So back to our style sheet. Here we're going to define a rule and set the background of the footer to 23, 23, 23. Take a look. Good. That's the right color. Now, back to our markup. Inside this footer, we're going to have a container, which happens to be a grid. So I'm going to place these items in a grid. On mobile, we have a 1-column grid. On desktop, we have a 5-column grid. So we have a grid. Now we need the template for a collapsible component. So let's bring up collapsible.html, grab all this code and paste it here. Good. Now I'm going to make a small change here. So in our template, we're representing a collapsible component using the div element. That's totally fine. But to make this markup more semantic, I'm going to replace this div with a section. So section. The reason I did this is because in our footer, we have multiple sections, okay? So here we have one section. Now I'm going to select this entire section and duplicate it a few times. And then change the labels. This one is going to be item 3 and The other one is going to be item 2. Let's see what we get up to this point. All right, we have 3 collapsibles and they're all expanded. So to make this more like our design mockup, I'm going to remove the expanded class from the last 2 collapsibles. So here we have a section for item 2. I'm going to remove the expanded class. Good. And one more time over here, delete. Now take a look. All right, that's closer to our design mockup. Next, we need to add some padding and a border between these items. So back to our markup, we're going to give each section an extra class for styling. What should we call this class? Footer _section, right? Now I'm going to repeat this for other sections. So here's one, and we have another section here. Good. And one more. Okay, back to our style sheet. Let's define a new rule and say our footer sections should have a padding of 2 rams and a border on the bottom that is 1 pixel solid with the color of 39, 39, 39. Take a look. All right, that's better. Now these items that we have here, they should be in uppercase and they should be slightly thinner. So once again, we need to give these headings an extra class. So here we have an H2. I'm going to give this an extra class like footer heading. Now you might be wondering why I'm not going to reuse this class for styling the heading. So couldn't we write a style like footer collapsible heading and then apply the styles here? We could certainly do this, but what if in the future we decide to remove these collapsibles and restructure this markup? So by assigning this specific class to our H2 element, we are defining this as an element inside the footer component. So our footers should have heading elements, and these headings should have a particular style, okay? Now, let's apply this class to other H2 elements. So here we have item 2. Let's add it here. And one more. Item 3. Good. Now the styles. So we're going to write footer heading. We're going to apply text transformation and make it uppercase. And we should also set the font weight to 600. Okay, that's better. Now let's add the logo and the copyright notice here. So back to our markup, here's the last section. After this, we're going to add another section and give it a class like footer brand. In this section, we're going to have an image. We're going to set the source to images/logo svg. And right below that, we're going to add a paragraph with the class of footer copyright. And here we say copyright 2020 Mosh Hamedani. Good. Now save the changes and let's see what we get. All right, here's what we get. There are 2 changes we need to apply here. We need to move this to the center and separate it from these items. So back to our style sheet, we're going to define a new rule and say footer brand should have a top margin of, let's say 5 rams. And the text align here should be center. Take a look. That's better. Next, we need to style the copyright notice. So we need one more rule, footer copyright. Here we're going to set the font size to 2.1 rams. The color should be white, but we should reduce the opacity to 0.3. I picked these numbers from our design mockup. So with this, we get this copyright notice. Great. So we've got the basics right. Now eventually we're going to replace these paragraphs with a list of hyperlinks. For now, I don't want to worry about it. So now we're going to work on the layout for tablets and wider screens. So we're going to write a media query for screens that are wider than 768 pixels. Here we're going to redefine the template of our grid. So back to our markup, here's our footer, and inside this footer we have a grid. Now once again, we can write a rule like footer grid, and that's probably going to work most of the time unless we add another grid in this footer for a different reason. In that case, we will want to give this element a specific class like footer sections, and then we don't have to worry about multiple grids in the footer. So let's rewrite this rule and say footer sections. Here we're going to set grid template columns to, what should we use? Well, one way is to use repeat and say 5 and 1 fr. That is totally fine. But if in the future we decide to add another section or another category of links, then we'll have to come back and revisit our code. So earlier I showed you a technique. Here we can use autofit so the grid can fit as many items as it can. But AutoFit doesn't work with just one FR. Here we have to use min-max and give it a minimum value, let's say 100 pixels or 10 rems, and a maximum of 1 FR. So back to the browser, here's what we get. It's not too bad, but there are a few things we need to improve here. First, we need to remove these chevrons, and then we need to show the content of all these sections. So back to our markup, here's our first section. In this section, we have an SVG that represents our chevron. Now, just a side note, I think it would be better to call this class collapsible toggler as opposed to collapsible chevron, because maybe in one place we want to show a chevron, but in another place, like our navigation bar, we want to show a menu icon. Now, I don't want to get distracted with renaming this in the middle of finishing this job. So for now, we're going to use this class, and then later we can come back and improve our code. So we have this collapsible chevron. Now, we go back to our media query and write another rule and say, in our footer, if we have a collapsible chevron, that should be hidden. Now, take a look. All the chevrons are gone. Using a similar technique, we're going to show the content of each section. So back to our section. In each section, we have a collapsible content. So we're going to target this inside our footer. We're going to say, in our footer, if we have a collapsible content, it should be visible. But here we cannot set display to block because earlier we used a different technique for animating the expansion of this object. So here we have to set opacity to 1 and max height to 100% of its container. Now take a look. All these blocks are visible. Great. So next we need to move this logo and put it before all these categories or all these sections. So we're going to write a new rule and say, footer brand, we're going to change the order of this element. So by default, the order of all these grid items is 0. If we set this to -1, then it will move before the first item. Great. Now, if you make the browser wider, everything is going to work. The only problem is the size of this font. So here we're going to write a new rule and say our copyright notice should have the font size of 1.5 rems. Okay, that's better. Now we need to move this to the top. Let's see why we have some extra space here. So here's the section that represents our brand. Now look at the computer tab. We have 50 pixels of margin on the top. We added this earlier in this rule, footer brand, because on mobile, we wanted to separate this from the previous items, but we don't need this on wider screens. So back to this rule, we're going to set margin top to, let's say 1 rem. Now take a look. All right, that looks pretty good. Next, we need to remove the border below each section. So we need one more rule here and say footer sections should have no border. Good. And the last thing we need to improve is the size of these headings. They're a little bit too large. So let's add one more rule and say our footer headings should have a font size of 1.6 rems. Good. That is very close to what we have in our design mockup. So now I'm going to pause the recording and replace these paragraphs with hyperlinks. So in this collapsible content, I've added an unordered list with this class. And here we have 3 list items, just as an example. Now, here's what we get. Let's see where this color is coming from. So inspect. We go to the computer tab and expand the color property. So this is coming from user agent. That is the default color that my browser has applied here. So we go back to the footer section and define a rule for all links in the footer. We're going to set their color to 777. We should also give them a hover effect. So if you hover on these links, the color should turn to pure white. And we want to apply this using a transition. So it looks really nice. Let's say 0.3 seconds. Good. All right, here's what we get. And we have this beautiful transition. Perfect. Now, one last thing. We need to get rid of this extra space. Let's inspect this element. So here's our collapsible content. Inside this, we have an unordered list. Now look at the computer tab. We have 18 pixels of margin above and below this item. Where is this coming from? Let's find out. So here we have margin block end that translates to margin bottom. And once again, this is defined in Chrome by default. So back to our style sheet. Here we can write a new rule and say, in a footer section, if we have a list, that list should have no margins. Of course, we could give this a specific class, but I think it's unnecessary for now. So let's move on and see what we get. All right, so I've added all these real labels and then found a problem. If we make the browser smaller, look at the logo, see what's happening? The reason this is happening is because we don't have a responsive image. So earlier we defined this rule for the brand section. Now I'm going to write a new rule and say,